Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Forged in Fire by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. Laura Sutton stood in the back row amongst the mourners, her black dress an appropriate match for the gray October sky. The preacher's words drifted over the small crowd like smoke, but Laura heard none of it. She watched her uncle instead. Uncle Harold stood at the front of the gathering, his face set in lines of grief that might have fooled anyone who didn't know him. But Laura had lived in his house for 3 years now. She knew that look in his eyes. It wasn't sorrow, it was calculation. Even before they'd lowered Aunt Margaret into the ground, Uncle Harold was shaking hands with Mr. Thornberry from the bank. Laura caught pieces of their hushed conversation. Poor girl will need guidance now. Quite right. No woman should be left to make such decisions alone. The property will need to be settled. Laura's stomach turned cold. Aunt Margaret wasn't even buried yet, and they were already discussing her like she was a problem to be solved. The funeral ended with a handful of dirt thrown onto the pine coffin. Laura watched the earth fall and felt something inside her chest break apart. Aunt Margaret had been the only person in the world who'd ever been truly kind to her. Now she was gone. The mourners began to drift away, murmuring their condolences as they passed. Laura remained by the graveside until only she and Uncle Harold were left. He cleared his throat. "Come along, Laura. We have matters to discuss." She followed him home in silence, her worn boots clicking against the cobblestones. The house felt different now, colder. Aunt Margaret's warmth had left with her. That evening, Uncle Harold called Laura into his study. She found him sitting behind his large oak desk, papers spread before him like battle plans. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, my dear." Laura sat, folding her hands in her lap. Something about his tone made her wary. "Now then," Uncle Harold began, shuffling through the papers, "your aunt's passing has left us in a difficult position. This house, the expenses, your upkeep, it's all become quite a burden." Laura said nothing. She'd been keeping house for 3 years, cooking, cleaning, and tending to Aunt Margaret during her illness. She'd hardly been a burden. "Fortunately," Uncle Harold continued, "I've found a solution that will benefit everyone." He looked up at her with what he probably thought was a kindly smile. "Mr. Hollingford has asked for your hand in marriage." The words hit Laura like a slap. "Mr. Hollingford?" "Yes, indeed, a fine gentleman, established, respectable." Laura knew Mr. Hollingford. He was 53 years old, recently widowed, and owned a dry goods store. He also had wandering hands and breath that smelled of onions and tobacco. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Laura said carefully. "It's quite simple. You'll marry Mr. Hollingford next month. He's already agreed to provide for you, and it will relieve me of the responsibility." Uncle Harold spoke as if he were discussing the weather. Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Uncle Harold, I haven't agreed to any such thing." His smile faltered. "I wasn't asking for your agreement, Laura. I was informing you of the arrangement." "Then you can inform him there will be no arrangement." Laura stood up, her heart hammering. "I won't marry a man I don't love. I won't marry a man I barely know." Uncle Harold's face darkened. "You ungrateful girl, do you think you have choices in this matter? You have no money, no property, no prospects. This is the best offer you'll ever receive." "I'd rather work for my living than sell myself in marriage." "Work?" Uncle Harold laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What work could you possibly do? You're 25 years old, Laura, already past the age when most decent men would consider you. Mr. Hollingford is being generous." Laura felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. "I said no." Uncle Harold stood as well, his hands flat on the desk. "Then you're a fool, and you'll regret this decision." 3 days later, Laura learned what Uncle Harold meant by regret. She was walking home from the market when Mrs. Patterson from down the street crossed to the other side of the road, rather than greet her. At the baker's shop, conversation stopped when she entered, and the other customers stared at her with a mixture of pity and disapproval. By evening, the truth became clear. Uncle Harold had been busy. He'd told anyone who would listen that Laura had suffered some kind of breakdown after her aunt's death, that she'd become difficult, possibly unstable, that she'd refused a perfectly good marriage proposal out of spite and willfulness. The rumors spread like wildfire through their small social circle. Laura was hysterical. Laura was ungrateful. Laura thought herself too good for honest folks. On the fourth day, Uncle Harold summoned her to his study again. "I trust you've had time to reconsider," he said without looking up from his newspaper. "I've had time to learn what kind of man you really are," Laura replied. Uncle Harold set down his paper. His face was calm, but his eyes were cold as winter. "Pack your things, Laura. You have until tomorrow morning to find somewhere else to live." This was Aunt Margaret's house, too. She would never have wanted. "Your aunt is dead. The house is mine, and I won't have a madwoman living under my roof." Laura felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "You're throwing me out? I'm simply removing a burden I can no longer afford to carry." Uncle Harold picked up his newspaper again. "Don't forget to leave the key." That night, Laura sat on her narrow bed and looked around the small room that had been her home for 3 years. She owned very little: some clothes, a few books, her sewing supplies, and the silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Everything fit into one small carpet bag. She had $17 to her name. In Philadelphia, that wouldn't last 2 weeks. The next morning, Laura found herself standing outside Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house on Chestnut Street. The building was narrow and gray, squeezed between a pawn shop and a laundry. The sign in the window read, "Rooms for Respectable Ladies." Mrs. Fletcher was a thin, sharp-faced woman who looked Laura up and down like she was examining a horse for purchase. "References?" Mrs. Fletcher asked. Laura hesitated. After Uncle Harold's campaign of whispers, she doubted anyone in Philadelphia would give her a good reference. "I'm afraid I don't have any." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "No references? That's unusual." "I can pay a week in advance," Laura said quickly, opening her purse. Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened slightly at the sight of money. "The room is $3 a week. Meals are extra. No men visitors. No drinking. No loud noises after 9 o'clock." Laura handed over the money. "I understand. Room 7, up 2 flights." The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small table. There would certainly be no swinging of a cat in there. The wallpaper was faded and peeling at the corners, but it was hers, at least for a week. Laura set her carpet bag on the bed and sat down heavily. For the first time since Aunt Margaret's funeral, she allowed herself to cry. When her tears were spent, Laura dried her eyes and looked around the dismal little room. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She needed work, and she needed it quickly. She spent the next 3 days walking the streets of Philadelphia, asking at shops and offices if they needed help. The answer was always the same: no positions available. Come back next month, try somewhere else. By the 4th day, Laura understood. Word of Uncle Harold's rumors had spread further than she'd realized. No one wanted to hire a woman with a questionable reputation. That afternoon, Laura found herself in a second-hand bookshop on Market Street, hoping to find something to read that might take her mind off her troubles. The shop was dusty and cramped, with books stacked in tottering piles on every surface. She was leafing through a collection of poetry when a folded paper fell from between the pages. Laura picked it up and saw the heading, "The Matrimonial Times." She'd heard of such papers, though she'd never seen one before. Publications where men and women could advertise for spouses. It was considered rather scandalous in polite society, but Laura was no longer part of polite society. Curious, she unfolded the paper and began to read. "Prosperous farmer seeks God-fearing wife for companionship and partnership in Nebraska territory. Well-established merchant desires refined lady for matrimony and mutual happiness in San Francisco." Most of the advertisements were elaborate, full of promises and grand descriptions. Laura read through them with growing skepticism. These men sounded too good to be true. Then, near the bottom of the page, she found one that was different. "E.R., blacksmith in Sand Creek, Kansas, seeks honest wife for simple life. No grand promises, only hard work and respect. Write to Box 247. Laura read the advertisement 3 times. There was something about its plain honesty that appealed to her. No flowery language or impossible promises, just a straightforward request from someone who seemed to understand that life was hard work. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her purse. That evening, in her small room at the boarding house, Laura sat at the tiny table with a sheet of writing paper before her. She'd been staring at the blank page for an hour, trying to find the right words. Finally, she dipped her pen in ink and began to write. Dear Sir, I saw your advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. I am 25 years old, able to cook and keep house, and I am not afraid of hard work. I have no family to speak of and no particular ties to Philadelphia. I believe in honesty and respect, as you mentioned in your advertisement. I will not make grand claims about my beauty or accomplishments. I am ordinary in most ways, but I am reliable and I keep my word. If you are looking for a partner rather than an ornament, I believe we might suit each other. If you wish to correspond, you may write to me at the address below. Respectfully, Miss Laura Sutton. Laura read the letter over twice, then folded it carefully and sealed it with wax. Tomorrow she would post it and hope for the best. She lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling and thinking about Kansas. She'd never been farther west than Lancaster County. Kansas seemed as foreign as China. But Philadelphia had nothing left for her now. Perhaps it was time to try somewhere new. Somewhere no one knew about Uncle Harold's lies or Mr. Heath Hollingford's unwelcome attentions. The next morning, Laura walked to the post office and handed her letter to the clerk. He weighed it, took her 3 cents, and tossed it into a canvas bag with dozens of other letters bound for points west. How long to Kansas? Laura asked. The clerk shrugged. 3 weeks, if the trains run on time. Laura walked back to the boarding house feeling lighter than she had in days. She'd done something. She'd taken action instead of just waiting for circumstances to crush her. Now all she could do was wait and hope that somewhere in Kansas, a blacksmith named E.R. might be looking for exactly what she had to offer: honesty, hard work, and a willingness to start over. The money from her first week's rent was running low, but Laura had found piecework with Mrs. Fletcher. She could mend clothes and do plain sewing for 2 cents an hour. It wasn't much, but it would keep her fed while she waited for a reply from Kansas. If a reply came at all. Laura folded her hands in her lap and made herself a promise. No matter what might happen, she wouldn't go back to Uncle Harold. She wouldn't marry Mr. Hollingford or anyone else just for security. She'd rather scrub floors or take in washing than surrender her right to choose her own path. Aunt Margaret had always told her that every ending was also a beginning. Laura hoped she was right. Chapter 2. Laura checked the boarding house mail slot every morning for weeks, starting a few weeks after she had first responded to the advertisement. Nothing came. Every afternoon, she walked to the post office and asked the clerk if any letters had arrived for her. The answer was always the same. Not today, miss. Try again tomorrow. By the 6th week, Laura had stopped hoping. She'd sent her letter to a stranger based on a few lines in a matrimonial paper. What had she expected? That a man in Kansas would be so desperate for a wife that he'd write back immediately? She was mending a torn shirt for Mrs. Fletcher when the landlady knocked on her door. Letter for you, Mrs. Fletcher said, holding out a thin envelope. Laura's hands shook as she took it. The return address read, E. Reaves, Sand Creek, Kansas, in neat, careful handwriting. Thank you, Laura managed. Mrs. Fletcher lingered in the doorway, clearly curious, but Laura said nothing more. After a moment, the older woman left with a disapproving sniff. Laura sat on her narrow bed and stared at the envelope. Part of her was afraid to open it. What if he'd written to refuse her? What if he'd changed his mind? Finally, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Miss Sutton, thank you for your letter. I was glad to receive it. You asked for honesty, so I will be direct. I am 32 years old and have been alone for the past 3 years. I came to Sand Creek to escape trouble in Missouri and have found peace here. The work is hard but honest. I built a small house near the edge of town, nothing fancy but solid. My nearest neighbor is Mrs. Vance, a widow who sometimes brings me pies and tells me I need a wife. I do not care for town gossip or grand social gatherings. I prefer quiet evenings and simple food. If you are looking for fine dresses and parties, I am not the man for you. But if you value honesty and hard work, as you said, perhaps we might suit each other after all. Write back if you are still interested. E. Reaves. Laura read the letter 3 times. His words were as plain and straightforward as his advertisement had been. No flowery promises or elaborate declarations. Just facts, stated simply. She liked that. After Uncle Harold's lies and manipulation, plain truth felt like cool water on a hot day. That evening, Laura wrote back. Mr. Reaves, thank you for your honest letter. I appreciate directness more than empty words. I have never cared much for parties or fine things. I would rather have a sturdy roof and honest company than silk dresses and false friends. I can cook simple meals and keep a clean house. I know how to preserve food for winter and mend clothes so they last. I take long walks when I need to think. There is a river here in Philadelphia that I visit when the city becomes too much. Do you have such places in Kansas? I would like to know more about your life there, if you are willing to share it. Respectfully, Laura Sutton. His second letter took only 3 weeks to arrive. Laura was beginning to watch for the mail with something approaching eagerness. Miss Sutton, Kansas is nothing but quiet places. I live at the edge of the prairie where you can see for miles in every direction. The grass grows tall as a man's shoulder and moves like water in the wind. Some folks find it lonely, but I find it peaceful. I have a dog named Deke who keeps me company at the forge. He is not much to look at, but has good sense and never causes trouble. The widow, Mrs. Vance, says I spoil him, but a man needs something to care for. You asked about my work. I shoe horses and mend farm tools mostly. Nothing fancy, but folks need what I do. The town is small but growing. We have a church, a general store, and a sheriff who keeps things orderly. What kind of work do you do in Philadelphia? You mentioned sewing in your first letter. E. Reaves. Laura smiled as she read about Deke the dog. She could picture Ted working at his forge with a faithful mutt lying nearby. It sounded like the kind of simple, honest life she dreamed of during her worst days with Uncle Harold. She wrote back immediately. Mr. Reaves, your description of Kansas sounds wonderful. I think I would like the wide spaces and quiet. Philadelphia is all noise and crowds and people rushing about their business. I make my living mending clothes for other people. It is not much, but it keeps me fed. I learned to sew from my aunt, who had gentle hands and endless patience. She taught me that small, careful stitches last longer than large, hasty ones. I think this is true for most things in life. I would like to hear more about your forge and your work. Do you enjoy being a blacksmith? Your dog Deke sounds like good company. I have always thought animals are better judges of character than most people. Laura. The letters came regularly after that. Laura found herself counting the weeks between them, hurrying to the post office as soon as she could reasonably expect mail to arrive from the West. Ted wrote about his work, describing the satisfaction of shaping hot iron into useful things. He told her about the small orchard he hoped to plant behind his house and how he'd been saving money to buy apple saplings. He mentioned his neighbors, speaking well of Sheriff Granger and fondly of Mrs. Vance, who continued to bring him food and advice in equal measure. Laura wrote about her walks along the Delaware River and the books she borrowed from the lending library. She described the changing seasons in Philadelphia and her small room at the boarding house. She told him about her sewing work, but she was careful never to mention Uncle Harold or the scandal that had driven her from her old life. As the seasons changed and fall turned to winter, their letters grew longer and more personal. Ted wrote about his past in Missouri, though he was vague about why he'd left. Laura sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press him for details. Everyone had things they'd rather not discuss. In December, Ted's letter contained something new. Laura, winter has come early this year. Snow covers the prairie and the wind cuts like a knife. But my house is warm and tight, and I have food stored for the cold months ahead. I have been thinking about the orchard I want to plant. Apple trees do better with care from 2 people than 1. A woman's touch makes a house a home, they say. I do not know if this is true, but I would like to find out. I hope you will not think me too forward, but I would be honored to have you as my wife. I know we have never met face to face, but I feel I know your heart from your letters. You are honest and kind and not afraid of hard work. Those are the qualities I value most in a person. If you are willing, I will send you money for a train ticket to Kansas. We can be married here in Sand Creek if you agree. I do not ask for an answer right away. Think about it carefully. Kansas is far from Philadelphia, and life here is simple, but sometimes hard. But if you are looking for a partner to share that life, I believe we might make each other happy. Yours truly, Ted Reaves. Laura set the letter down with trembling hands. A proposal. An actual proposal from a man who seemed decent and honest and kind. She walked to her small window and looked out at the gray Philadelphia street. Snow was falling here too, but it quickly turned to dirty slush on the cobblestones. The building across the way was crowded with families who yelled at each other through thin walls. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse manure and too many people living too close together. What did she have here? A tiny room that cost her most of her earnings, work that barely kept her fed. No friends, no family, no prospects for anything better. Uncle Harold had been right about one thing. She was 25 and unmarried. In Philadelphia, that made her an object of pity at best, suspicion at worst. But in Kansas, she might be something different. A partner, a wife, a woman with a purpose. That night, Laura sat down at her small table and wrote the most important letter of her life. Dear Ted, yes, I will marry you. I have thought about little else since your letter arrived. You offer me that which I never expected to find, an honest partnership and a chance to build something good together. I am not afraid of hard work or simple living. I would rather have a small, warm house on the Kansas prairie than all the grand mansions in Philadelphia. When should I come? I can be ready to travel whenever you think best. Thank you for seeing something in me worth having. I promise to be the wife you deserve. With all my affection, Laura. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived. Inside was a train ticket dated for February 15th and a brief note. Laura, if you are still willing, I will meet you at the Sand Creek station. The ticket will take you as far as Kansas. I will be waiting. The journey is long, but the trains are safe. Bring warm clothes and whatever you cannot bear to leave behind. I am counting the days until I get to see your face, Ted. Laura held the ticket in her hands and felt her heart racing. In less than a month, she would leave Philadelphia forever. She would marry a man she'd never met and start a new life in a place she'd never seen. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt more hopeful than she had in years. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Laura sold her few remaining possessions and used the money to buy sturdy traveling clothes. She packed her sewing supplies carefully, knowing they might be useful in her new life. She wrote a brief letter to Mrs. Fletcher, thanking her for the room and giving her notice. Mrs. Fletcher was clearly curious about Laura's sudden departure, but Laura offered no explanation. Let the old busybody wonder. In a few days, it wouldn't matter. On the morning of February 15th, Laura stood on the platform at the Pennsylvania Railroad station with her single valise and her sewing basket. The train to Kansas stretched out before her like a promise, black smoke rising from its stack. She climbed aboard and found a seat by the window. When the train pulled away from Philadelphia, Laura watched the familiar buildings slide past. She felt no sadness at leaving. This place had given her nothing but heartache and disappointment. Kansas, she hoped, would be different. Chapter 3. Laura stepped down from the train onto the wooden platform at Sand Creek Station, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wind hit her immediately, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of snow and something else she couldn't name. Freedom, maybe, or loneliness. She set her valise on the platform and looked around. The town was smaller than she'd imagined from Ted's letters. A handful of buildings clustered around the railroad tracks, like chickens huddling against the wind. The general store, the church with its simple wooden cross, and a saloon with batwing doors that swayed in the breeze. A man with a clipboard stood near the station house, checking names against a list as passengers gathered their belongings. Laura waited, smoothing her skirts nervously. Surely Ted would be here soon. Perhaps he was running late. Laura looked around nervously, searching for a face that might belong to Ted. She'd sent him her photograph months ago, but she had no idea what he looked like. The man with the clipboard called out names. Henderson! Package for Henderson! A bearded farmer stepped forward to claim a wooden crate. Mrs. Morrison, letter from Denver. Laura waited. Her name wasn't called. The platform began to empty as people collected their belongings and headed into town. The train hissed and steamed, preparing for the next leg of its journey west. Still no sign of Ted. Laura picked up her valise and approached the man with the clipboard. Excuse me, sir, I'm looking for Ted Reaves. He was supposed to meet me here. The man looked up from his list. His face was weathered and kind, but something flickered in his eyes when she mentioned Ted's name. You here for him, then? Sorry, miss, I ain't seen him. Thank you. What was behind that momentary flicker at the mention of Ted Reaves, she had to wonder. Was there a bad turn on the horizon? As if in answer to the question she had inadvertently thrown into the universe, a man wearing a sheriff's badge approached her. He was middle-aged with kind eyes and a trim mustache. Miss Sutton, he asked. Yes, that's me. I'm Sheriff Granger. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. His voice was gentle but serious. There's no easy way to say this, miss. Ted Reaves is dead. Laura felt the world tilt around her. Dead? There was a fire at his forge last week. The whole building went up in flames. We tried to get him out, but the sheriff shook his head sadly. I'm sorry, miss. The building collapsed before we could reach him. Laura stared at the sheriff, unable to make sense of his words. Dead. Ted was dead. Nothing survived, Sheriff Granger continued. The fire burned too hot, too fast. The whole building collapsed. Like I said, we tried to save him. Sheriff Granger shook his head sadly. I'm sorry, miss. I know you came a long way. Laura stared at him, unable to process the words. Ted was dead. The man who'd written to her about apple orchards and his dog Deke. The man who'd sent her a train ticket and promised to meet her at this very station, the man she'd been writing to for months, the man she'd planned to marry, was gone. Laura felt her knees go weak. She set her valise down again harder this time. I don't understand, she whispered. It was an accident, a terrible accident, miss, Sheriff Granger said. These things happen with forges sometimes. A spark catches something it shouldn't, and the whole place goes up in flames. Sheriff Granger put his hat back on. I know you came a long way. If you need help finding passage back east? No. The word came out sharper than Laura intended. She couldn't go back to Philadelphia. Uncle Harold had made sure of that, and she had no money for the return passage anyway. She'd spent everything on the train ticket west. Laura felt tears burning her eyes, but she blinked them back. She was stranded in a town she'd never seen, with no money to get home and nowhere to go. What was she supposed to do now? Miss Sutton, are you all right? Laura forced herself to focus on the sheriff's concerned face. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. She was lost and alone in a strange place, in a town she'd never seen, in a state she'd never visited, with no money and nowhere to go. The man she'd planned to marry, on whom she'd pinned all her hopes, was dead, and she was utterly alone. She had no idea what she was going to do next. If you need a place to stay, Sheriff Granger began. Thank you, Laura said quickly. I'll manage. She picked up her valise and walked away from the station, her boots clicking against the wooden platform. Behind her, the train whistle blew, and she heard the great locomotive starting to move again. Her last connection to the world she'd known was leaving without her. Behind her, Sheriff Granger called out something about helping her find a place to stay, but Laura could not fathom his words. Nothing made sense to her. All she could think about was Ted's letters, full of plans for the future they would never have. The apple orchard they would never plant together, the warm house where she would never be welcome. Laura had come to Kansas looking for a new life. Instead, she'd found only another ending. Laura walked down the main street of Sand Creek, looking at the buildings Ted had mentioned in his letters. The general store where Mrs. Vance probably shopped for supplies to make those pies she'd brought him. The church where they might have been married if he'd lived. Her chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing her lungs. She couldn't catch her breath properly. This couldn't be happening. Not again. She'd finally found something good, something hopeful, and now it was gone. Laura found herself sitting on the steps of the church without remembering how she'd come to be there. The sun was dropping lower in the sky, and the wind was picking up. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and stared at the empty street. What was she supposed to do now? She had maybe $3 in her purse. Enough for a few meals, but not enough to get back to Philadelphia even if she'd wanted to go. And she didn't want to go back. There was nothing for her there but shame and Uncle Harold's satisfied smirk. The church door opened behind her, and Laura turned to see an older woman emerge. She was plump and gray-haired, with kind brown eyes and work-roughened hands. "Child, are you all right?" the woman asked. "You've been sitting here for near an hour." Laura looked around in surprise. The sun was much lower than she'd realized. Evening shadows were stretching across the street. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be in the way." "You're not in the way." The woman sat down beside Laura on the steps. "I'm Mrs. Eaton. I help with the church services. Are you the young lady who came to marry Ted Reaves?" Laura nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I'm so sorry, dear, but I don't know your name. It was a terrible thing with poor Ted. He was a good man. Quiet, but good." Laura felt tears threatening again. "My name is Laura Sutton, Mrs. Easton. I don't know what to do now." Mrs. Eaton patted Laura's hand. "Well, you can't sit here all night. The wind gets fierce after dark. Do you have somewhere to stay?" "No. Then you had better come with me, I should think. We'll get you sorted out." Mrs. Eaton stood and brushed off her skirts. "The general store sometimes takes in boarders. Mr. Walsh is a decent man, and his wife died last year. He could probably use the help." Laura picked up her valise and followed Mrs. Eaton down the street. The general store was a solid-looking building with large windows and a painted sign that read, "Walsh's Dry Goods and Sundries." Mrs. Eaton pushed open the door, and a bell jingled overhead. The store smelled of coffee and leather and something sweet. A thin man with graying hair looked up from behind the counter. "Evening, Mrs. Eaton. What can I do for you?" "This is Miss Sutton, Mr. Walsh. She's the young lady who came to marry poor Ted. She needs a place to stay." Mr. Walsh's expression softened. "I heard about your situation, miss. Terrible business." He studied Laura for a moment. "I suppose you're looking for work as well as lodging?" Laura nodded. "I can cook and clean. I'm good with sewing and mending." "Can you keep books? Add figures?" "Yes, sir." Mr. Walsh nodded. "There's a small room upstairs. Used to be my wife's sewing room. I can let you have it in exchange for helping in the store. Sweeping, stocking shelves, maybe helping with the accounts. I'm not much good with numbers." "That would be very kind." "It's not charity," Mr. Walsh said firmly. "I need the help. Stiffness in my old fingers makes it hard to lift the heavy goods, and I can't read the small print like I used to." Mrs. Eaton smiled. "There, you see? Things work out if you give them time." Mr. Walsh led Laura through the store and up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The room he showed her was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. "Meals are extra," Mr. Walsh said, "but there's a coffee pot downstairs you can use, and Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house serves supper for 25 cents. Laura set her valise on the bed. "Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I'll work hard." "I'm sure you will." He paused in the doorway. "I was sorry to hear about Ted. He was a good customer, always paid his bills on time and never caused trouble." After Mr. Walsh left, Laura sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new home. It was smaller than her room at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house in Philadelphia, but it felt warmer somehow. The quilt on the bed was hand-stitched, and someone had left a few books on the small shelf by the window. Laura opened her valise and began to unpack her few belongings: her 2 dresses, her undergarments, her sewing kit. At the bottom of the valise, wrapped carefully in her spare petticoat, were Ted's letters. She pulled them out and held them in her lap. Months of correspondence, full of quiet hopes and simple dreams, all of it meaningless now. Laura lay down on the narrow bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. The building creaked and settled around her. Somewhere downstairs, she could hear Mr. Walsh moving about, probably closing up the store for the night. She thought about Ted's letters, about the apple orchard he'd wanted to plant and the dog he'd loved. She thought about the life they might have built together, the simple happiness he'd offered her. Now he was dead, and she was alone again. But this time, she wasn't going to give up. She'd come too far and risked too much to turn back now. She'd make a life here in Sand Creek somehow, with or without Ted Reaves. Not that she had that particular choice, of course. It would have to be without Ted Reaves now. She'd proved to herself and everyone else that Laura Sutton was stronger than her circumstances. The next morning, Laura woke early and went downstairs to help Mr. Walsh open the store. She swept the floors and dusted the shelves, familiarizing herself with the layout. Bolts of fabric here, tools and hardware there, foodstuffs along the back wall. Around mid-morning, the bell above the door jingled and a woman entered. She was perhaps 40 years old with brown hair and a pleasant face. She wore a dark blue dress and carried a basket over her arm. "Good morning, Mr. Walsh," she said. Then she noticed Laura. "And you must be the young lady who came to marry Ted." Laura looked up from the bolt of calico she was straightening. "Yes, ma'am." The woman studied Laura with sharp eyes. "I'm Mrs. Vance. I was a friend of Ted's." Laura felt her stomach tighten. This was the widow who'd brought Ted pies, the one he'd mentioned in his letters, the woman who'd told him he needed a wife. "I'm sorry for your loss," Laura said carefully. Mrs. Vance sniffed. "It's a strange thing, isn't it? Coming all this way to marry a man you'd never met face to face." Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose it is. Most folks would call it foolish, trusting your life to a few letters from a stranger." Mrs. Vance's tone wasn't exactly unkind, but there was something sharp in it, something that felt like suspicion. "Perhaps," Laura said, "but sometimes people don't have many choices." Mrs. Vance picked up a can of peaches and examined the label. "Still, it makes one wonder, what kind of woman travels halfway across the country for a man she's never seen?" The word stung, but Laura had heard worse from Uncle Harold's friends in Philadelphia. She lifted her chin and met Mrs. Vance's gaze, the kind who's willing to work for what she wants instead of waiting for it to be handed to her. Mrs. Vance set down the can of peaches with a sharp click. "Well, I suppose we'll see about that." After Mrs. Vance left, Mr. Walsh emerged from the back room where he'd been inventorying supplies. "Don't mind her," he said quietly. "She's been alone too long, makes some folks bitter." That evening, Laura sat in her small room and wrote in the journal she'd started keeping on the train. She needed to record her thoughts to make sense of what had happened. March 1st, 1880. I have been in Sand Creek for 2 days now. Ted is dead, and I am alone again. But I will not give up. I cannot go back to Philadelphia, and I would not want to even if I could. There must be something for me here, some purpose, some life worth living. Mrs. Vance clearly thinks I'm a fool for coming here. Perhaps she's right, but I would rather be a fool with hope than a wise woman with none. Laura closed the journal and put it away. Tomorrow she would continue learning her duties at the store. She would make herself useful to Mr. Walsh and prove that she belonged here. She would build a life in Sand Creek, one day at a time. She had no other choice. But maybe, for the first time in her life, that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe choosing to stay was better than being forced to leave. Laura blew out her candle and settled into bed. Outside her window, the wind howled across the prairie, but she felt strangely comforted by the sound. It was the same wind that had blown through Ted's letters, the same vast sky he'd described in his careful handwriting. He might be gone, but something of what he'd promised her remained. The chance to start over, the opportunity to become someone new. Laura pulled the quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was safe and warm and free to make her own choices. Chapter 4. Laura had been working at Walsh's store for 5 days when she decided she needed air. The walls of the building seemed to press closer each morning, and even the kindness of Mr. Walsh couldn't ease the weight in her chest. She finished sweeping the front steps and told Mr. Walsh she was going for a walk. "Don't go too far," he warned. "The prairie can fool you. Looks flat as a table, but there are gullies and holes that'll swallow a person whole." Laura promised to be careful and set off down the main street. At the edge of town, the road gave way to a dirt path that wound between low hills covered in brown grass. She tucked her sketchbook under her arm and walked steadily away from Sand Creek. She'd taken up sketching again in the evenings, drawing the view from her window or the arrangement of goods in the store. It helped quiet her mind when thoughts of Ted's letters became too painful. Today, She hoped to find something worth drawing. A tree, perhaps, or an interesting rock formation. The morning was crisp and clear, with a sharp blue sky that seemed to stretch forever. Laura could see why Ted had written about the vastness of this place. It was nothing like Philadelphia, where buildings blocked the horizon and smoke dimmed the sun. Here a person could walk for hours and never see another soul. The thought should have been lonely, but instead, Laura found it peaceful. No one to judge her or whisper about her past. No Uncle Harold scheming behind her back. Just space and silence and the sound of wind through grass. She climbed a low ridge and paused to catch her breath. The view from the top was breathtaking. Rolling prairie stretched in every direction, dotted with patches of snow that hadn't yet melted. In the distance, she could see a line of trees that probably marked a creek or river. Laura opened her sketchbook and began to draw. The lines of the horizon, the texture of the grass, the way the shadows fell across the land. She lost herself in the work, grateful for a distraction from what was her uncertain future. She was adding details to her rendition of a cluster of rocks when something caught her eye. A thin wisp of smoke rising from a fold in the prairie about a mile away. Laura lowered her pencil and squinted into the distance. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. But Mr. Walsh had told her there were no farms this far from town. What could be burning out there? Curiosity pulled at her stronger than caution. Laura closed her sketchbook and began walking toward the smoke. The ground was more uneven than it had looked from the ridge, broken by shallow gullies and patches of loose stone. She had to watch her footing carefully. When she drew closer, she could make out the source of the smoke. A small building nestled in a depression between two hills. It was little more than a shack, really. The walls were of weathered gray wood, and the roof sagged in the middle. It looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. Laura approached slowly. The smoke was coming from a crooked chimney, and she could see light in one of the windows. Someone was definitely living there, though she couldn't imagine why anyone would choose such a remote spot. She was about 50 yards away when she heard a dog bark. Not a friendly bark, but a sharp warning. Laura stopped and looked around, but saw no sign of an animal. The bark came again from inside the shack, then a man's voice, low and rough. "Quiet, Deke." Laura's heart stopped. Deke, that was the name of Ted's dog, the one he'd written about in his letters. But Ted was dead. Sheriff Granger had told her so himself. She crept closer, keeping low behind a pile of weathered fence posts. The window of the shack was grimy, but she could see movement inside. A man's silhouette, tall and broad-shouldered. Laura's hands began to shake. It couldn't be. Ted was dead. But the voice, the dog's name, she had to know for certain. Laura approached the door of the shack on trembling legs. It hung crooked on its hinges, leaving a gap at the bottom where cold air could seep in. She raised her hand to knock, then stopped. What if she was wrong? What if this were just some stranger who happened to have a dog named Deke? But what if she was right? Laura knocked softly on the door. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. Then the scrape of a chair being pushed back and heavy footsteps across a hard, packed floor. The door opened a crack, and Laura found herself looking into a pair of deep blue eyes set in a gaunt, bearded face. She knew those eyes. She'd imagined them countless times while reading Ted's letters. "Ted?" she whispered. The man's face went white. He tried to slam the door shut, but Laura pushed against it with strength she didn't know she possessed. "You're dead," she said, her voice rising. "They told me you were dead." Ted Reaves, very much alive despite the soot on his clothes and the crude bandage wrapped around his left leg, stared at her with something that might have been panic. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in days. "You need to leave, now." Laura shoved the door open wider and stepped inside. The shack was even smaller than it had looked from outside. A single room with a bed in one corner, a rickety table, and a stone fireplace where a small fire burned. A brown and white dog sat beside the hearth, watching her with intelligent eyes. "Hello, Deke," Laura said quietly. The dog's tail wagged once, as if he remembered her voice from somewhere. Laura turned back to Ted, and the shock of seeing him alive gave way to a rage so fierce it surprised her. How could you? How could you let me believe you were dead?" Ted leaned heavily against the doorframe. Up close, she could see how thin he'd become, how his clothes hung loose on his frame. The bandage on his leg was stained with old blood. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said. "You weren't supposed to come. I wrote to you. I told you I was coming. I never got the letter." Ted's voice was barely above a whisper. "By the time I heard there was a woman asking for me in town, it was too late. You'd already been told I was dead." Laura felt tears burning her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry in front of him, not after what he'd put her through. "Why?" she demanded. "Why fake your death? Why live out here like some kind of hermit?" Ted closed the door and limped back to the chair by the fire. His movements were careful, like he was in constant pain. "Because there are people looking for me," he said. "Dangerous people. If they knew I was alive, they'd come here. They'd hurt innocent folks to get to me." "What people? What did you do?" Ted looked into the fire, his face hard as stone. "I stood up to men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. I fought back when I should have kept my head down. And people died because of it." Laura sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak. "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand." Ted turned to look at her, and she saw something desperate in his eyes. "You just need to forget you saw me. Go back to town, live your life, and pretend Ted Reaves is buried in the ground where he belongs." "I can't do that." "You have to, for your own safety." Aura stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "Don't you dare talk to me about my safety. Do you know what you've put me through? I traveled halfway across the country to marry you. I gave up everything I had left in Philadelphia. I grieved for you." "I never asked you to come," Ted said, but his voice was gentler now. "You sent me a train ticket." "I sent that before." He stopped and shook his head. "It doesn't matter now. What's done is done." "No, it's not done." Laura moved closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face. "You're hurt. You're living like an animal in this hovel. When did you last have a proper meal?" "Laura, you need to listen to me." Ted struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "The men who are looking for me, they're not the kind to give up. If they find out you know I'm alive, they'll use you to get to me. I won't have your blood on my hands, and I won't have yours on mine." Laura looked around the miserable little shack. "How long have you been living like this?" "Since the fire. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I lose track of the days." "You're going to die out here if you don't get proper care." Ted sat back down heavily, and Laura saw him wince. The injury to his leg was worse than she'd thought. "Maybe that would be for the best," he said quietly. Laura felt something break open inside her chest. The man she'd fallen in love with through his letters, the one who'd written about apple orchards and quiet evenings, was sitting before her, ready to give up and die. "No," she said firmly. "I won't let that happen." "You can't stop it. You shouldn't even try." Laura looked at Ted's pale face, at the dog who lay loyally at his feet, at the cold little room where he was slowly wasting away. She thought about all the letters he'd written, full of hope for their future together. That man was still in there somewhere, buried under guilt and pain and fear. "I came here to marry Ted Reaves," she said. "I'm not leaving until I find him." She walked to the door and pulled it open. The cold air rushed in, making the fire flicker. "Where are you going?" Ted called after her. Laura turned back to look at him one last time. "Back to town, but I'll be back tomorrow." "Laura, don't. Please, just forget you ever saw me." But Laura was already walking away, her mind racing with plans. She would bring food and clean bandages. She would figure out how to help him properly, whether he wanted her help or not. She'd lost too much already to lose Ted Reaves twice. The walk back to Sand Creek seemed shorter than the journey out. Laura's anger carried her over the uneven ground and up the ridge where she'd started her sketch. She paused there and looked back toward the hidden shack. Ted was alive, hurt and hiding and afraid, but alive. Everything she'd mourned for the past week had been a lie. The grief, the loneliness, the sense that her last chance at happiness had been stolen from her. But now she knew the truth. And despite everything, despite his deception and his insistence that she leave him alone, Laura felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. She tucked her sketchbook under her arm and headed back toward town. Tomorrow, she would return to that miserable shack, and she would begin the work of saving Ted Reaves from himself, whether he wanted to be saved or not. By the time Laura reached the main street of Sand Creek, the sun was high overhead. Mr. Walsh looked up from his ledger as she entered the store. "Find anything worth drawing?" he asked. Laura thought about the weathered shack, the injured man, and the loyal dog keeping watch by the fire. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I did." That evening, Laura sat in her small room above the store and stared at the blank page of her journal. How could she write about what she'd discovered? How could she put into words the shock of seeing Ted alive, the fury at his deception, the desperate hope that had taken root in her chest? Instead, she wrote simply, "Today I learned that some stories have more than one ending." She closed the journal and began making a list of supplies: bread, clean water, bandages, and medicine, if she could find it. Tomorrow, she would go back to that shack, and this time she wouldn't take no for an answer. Ted Reaves might think his story was over, but Laura had other ideas. She'd come too far to give up on him now. Outside her window, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying the promise of another cold night. Laura pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried not to think about Ted alone in that freezing shack with only his dog for warmth. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Chapter 5. Laura woke before dawn with her mind already made up. She dressed quickly in the gray light filtering through her small window and crept downstairs to the store. Mr. Walsh wouldn't be up for another hour, which gave her time to gather what she needed. She wrapped half a loaf of bread in clean cloth and filled a mason jar with water from the pump behind the building. From the store's supplies, she took a roll of clean cotton bandages and a small bottle of carbolic acid that Mr. Walsh kept for treating cuts and scrapes. Laura left a note on the counter explaining that she would pay for the medical supplies from her wages, then slipped out the back door of the store. The morning air was sharp and cold, and frost crunched under her boots as she made her way to the edge of town. The walk to the shack seemed shorter in daylight. Laura found the path she'd taken yesterday and followed it across the rolling prairie. The sun was just breaking over the horizon when she reached the weathered little building. She knocked on the door and waited. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "Ted, it's Laura." She heard movement inside, then Ted's voice, hoarse and weak. "Go away. I'm not going anywhere." Laura tried the door and found it unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Ted was still in bed, covered by a thin blanket that had seen better days. His face was flushed with fever, and his eyes were bright and glassy. Deke lay beside the bed, watching Laura with worried brown eyes. "You shouldn't be here," Ted said, but his voice lacked the strength of yesterday's protests. Laura set her bundle on the rickety table and looked around the miserable little room. The fire had died down to embers, and the air was cold enough to see her breath. "When did you last eat?" she asked. Ted didn't answer. Laura opened the cloth bundle and pulled out the bread, tearing off a piece and holding it out to him. "Eat this." "I'm not hungry." "I don't care if you're hungry or not. You're sick, and you need food." Laura's voice was firm. "Eat it, or I'll force it down your throat myself." Ted looked at her for a long moment, then took the bread with shaking fingers. He ate slowly, as if the simple act of chewing required all his concentration. Laura built up the fire and set the jar of water near the flames to warm. When she turned back to Ted, he was watching her with something that might have been gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because someone needs to." Laura pulled the single chair closer to the bed and sat down. "And because you're going to tell me the truth this time. All of it." Ted closed his eyes. "Laura, you don't understand what you're getting into." "Then explain it to me." "If I tell you, it puts you in danger. The people looking for me, they're not the kind to leave witnesses." Laura felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "What kind of people are they?" Ted was quiet for so long that Laura thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression so full of pain that it made her chest ache. "Have you ever heard of the Redstone Men?" Laura shook her head. "They're a gang of hired guns, killers who work for whoever pays them best." Ted's voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, they were working for a cattle syndicate in Missouri, the Barrett Land Company. Laura leaned forward. "What did they want?" "Land, water rights. They'd find a place they wanted and make the people an offer. If the offer was refused, they'd make things unpleasant until folks changed their minds. What kind of unpleasant? Ted looked into the fire. Burned crops, dead cattle. Sometimes they'd rough up a man in front of his family, whatever it took to make people sell cheap and leave fast. Laura felt sick. And you fought them? I tried to. Ted's laugh was bitter. I was the blacksmith in Redstone Gulch, a town about the size of Sand Creek. When the Barrett Company made its offer, most folks wanted to take it and move on, but a few of us thought we could stand up to them. What happened? Ted was quiet again, staring at the flames. When he spoke, his voice was so low that Laura had to strain to hear him. We organized, got the townspeople to refuse the offers altogether. We figured if we stood as one, Barrett couldn't force us all out. That sounds brave. It was stupid. Ted's eyes were full of self-reproach. I had a younger brother, Tom. He was only 19, full of fire and righteous anger. I should have sent him away when the trouble started, but he wouldn't go. Said he wouldn't abandon me or the town. Laura's heart sank. She could see where this story was heading. The Redstone men came at night, Ted continued. Set fires all over town. The general store, the church, half a dozen houses. People were running everywhere, trying to save what they could. His voice broke. Tom went back into our house to get our mother's Bible. The roof came down on him. Laura reached out without thinking and took Ted's hand. His fingers were cold and rough, scarred from years of working with hot metal. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I tried to dig him out, but the whole building was on fire. The other men had to drag me away. Ted's grip on her hand tightened. I could hear him calling for help, and I couldn't reach him. Tears ran down Laura's cheeks. She could picture it all too clearly, the flames and smoke, the desperate young man trapped under burning timbers. That's when I knew I had to leave, Ted said. As long as I stayed in Missouri, the Redstone men would keep coming after anyone who'd stood with me. So I ran, changed my name, came west, tried to start over. Laura wiped her eyes with her free hand. But they followed you. Not right away. I thought I'd lost them. For 2 years, I lived quietly in Sand Creek, built my forge, and minded my own business. Then last month, word came through that they were asking questions in Kansas, looking for a blacksmith who'd been in Missouri during the Troubles. So you faked your death, Ted nodded, set fire to the forge myself and slipped away in the confusion. I've been hiding out here ever since, hoping they'd move on. Laura looked around the cold, miserable shack. This is no way to live. It's better than being dead or getting other people killed. Laura thought about his words, trying to process everything he'd told her. The story was horrible, but it explained so much. The sadness in his letters, his reluctance to talk about his past, the way he'd written about valuing quiet over grandeur. Why didn't you run farther? She asked. You could have gone to California or up north to Montana. Ted looked at her with tired eyes. Because I got tired of running. This is as far as I go. Laura stood up and checked the water by the fire. It was warm now, not quite hot, but warm enough for what she needed to do. Let me see your leg, she said. Laura, let me see it, Ted. That bandage looks like it hasn't been changed in days. Reluctantly, Ted pushed back the blanket and rolled up his pant leg. The bandage was stained with old blood and something that might have been infection. Laura's stomach turned, but she kept her expression calm. This is bad, she said. When did you last clean it? I don't remember. Laura poured some of the warm water into a cup and added a few drops of carbolic acid. The sharp smell filled the small room. This is going to hurt, she warned. Ted gritted his teeth and nodded. Laura carefully unwrapped the old bandage. The wound underneath was red and swollen, with angry-looking streaks radiating out from the edges. She'd seen enough infected cuts in Philadelphia to know this was serious. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, using strips of clean cloth soaked in the carbolic solution. Ted's jaw was clenched tight, but he didn't make a sound. How did this happen? Laura asked as she worked. Piece of burning timber fell on me when I was setting the fire, caught me right across the shin. Ted's voice was strained. I pulled it out and kept going. You should have tended to it right away. I was more worried about getting away clean. Laura finished cleaning the wound and wrapped it in fresh bandages. The new white cotton looked stark against Ted's pale skin. There, she said. That should help, but you need proper medicine, and rest and decent food. I'll manage. Laura sat back in the chair and looked at him seriously. Ted, I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. He waited. Do you trust me? The question seemed to surprise him. What? Do you trust me? After everything you've told me, after all the lies and deception, do you trust me enough to tell me the truth from now on? Ted stared at her for a long moment. Why would you want to get involved in this mess? Because I already am involved. The moment I stepped off that train looking for you, I became part of your story. Laura leaned forward. And because, despite everything, I still believe you're a good man. The man who wrote those letters, who dreamed of apple orchards and quiet evenings, he's still in there somewhere. That man got his brother killed. That man tried to protect his community from criminals. There's a difference. Ted closed his eyes. Laura, if you stay mixed up in this, you could get hurt, or worse. You already endangered me, Laura said dryly. The least you can do is be honest about it. Despite everything, Ted's mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone softer, someone who would cry and run away when things got difficult. I stopped running away from difficult things when Uncle Harold threw me out of his house. I won't start again now. Ted opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, as if he was seeing her for the first time. If I tell you everything, he said slowly, if I stop hiding things from you, will you promise me something? What? If things get dangerous, if the Redstone men come here, you'll get as far away from me as possible. You'll run and not look back. Laura considered his words. She thought about Uncle Harold's threats, about the long journey west, about the strength she'd found in herself when everything else had been stripped away. I promise I'll do whatever I think is right when the time comes, she said. But I won't promise to abandon you. I've had enough of being abandoned. Ted stared at her for a long time. Then slowly he nodded. All right, he said. No more lies. Laura felt something settle in her chest, a sense of partnership that she'd never experienced before. No more lies. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind whistle around the corners of the little shack. Deke had moved closer to the fire and was watching them both with intelligent eyes. I should go, Laura said eventually. Mr. Walsh will be wondering where I am. Will you? Ted hesitated. Will you come back? Tomorrow morning, and I'll bring more food and medicine. Laura stood and gathered her things. And Ted, start thinking about what we're going to do next, because you can't live like this forever. She was almost to the door when Ted called her name. She turned back to find him struggling to sit up in bed. Thank you, he said quietly. For not running away. Laura smiled, the first real smile she'd felt since arriving in Sand Creek. I told you, I'm done with running. She stepped out into the morning sunlight and began the walk back to town. Behind her, smoke rose from the chimney of the little shack, and she knew that inside, Ted was probably already planning their next move. For the first time since Uncle Harold had thrown her out of his house, Laura felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because everything was easy or safe, but because she was choosing to be there. She was choosing to fight for something worth having, and that made all the difference. Chapter 6. Laura had been visiting the shack for a week when she realized Ted was waiting for her. She crested the low ridge that morning with her usual bundle of bread and water, and there he was, standing in the doorway. He dragged the single chair outside and positioned it where she could sit in the pale March sunshine. You're feeling better, Laura said as she approached. Some. Ted's voice was stronger than it had been, though he still leaned heavily against the doorframe. The fever broke yesterday. Laura set her bundle on the ground and took the offered chair. The morning was crisp, but not bitter, and she was grateful to sit outside instead of in the dim, cramped interior of the shack. How's the leg? She asked. Ted rolled up his pant leg to show her the bandage. The swelling had gone down, and the angry red streaks were fading. Better, much better. Good. Laura unpacked the bread and handed him a piece. You need to keep eating. You're still too thin. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the grass sway in the wind. It was a view Laura had come to love over the past week, the vast openness of it, the way the sky seemed to go on forever. She could understand why Ted had chosen to stay in Kansas instead of running farther. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Ted said suddenly. Laura looked at him in surprise. In all their conversations over the past week, they'd talked mostly about practical things, his healing, the weather, and the supplies she brought. Neither of them had pressed for personal details. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me." Laura considered this. She'd grown used to keeping her past private, but something about the quiet morning and Ted's patient attention made her want to speak. "It's crowded," she said finally. "Always noisy, always rushing. People live on top of each other in narrow houses with thin walls. You can hear your neighbors arguing and crying and laughing, but you hardly ever speak to them." "Sounds lonely." "It is." Laura picked at the crust of her bread. "I lived with my aunt and uncle after my parents died. My aunt was kind, but she was often sick. My uncle—" Laura paused. "My uncle was a practical man. He saw me as a burden to be managed." Ted didn't say anything, but Laura could feel him listening. "When my aunt died, he tried to marry me off to a business associate, a man twice my age who smelled of onions and had wandering hands." Laura's voice hardened. "When I refused, my uncle spread lies about me, said I was unstable, ungrateful. He made sure no decent family would hire me or rent me a room." "That's why you answered my advertisement." "That's why I had no choice but to answer your advertisement." Laura looked at Ted. "I wasn't looking for romance or adventure. I was looking for a way to survive with some dignity." Ted was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For what?" "For putting you through more suffering. You came here hoping for safety, and instead you found a man living like a fugitive." Laura studied his face. The beard was growing back where she'd trimmed it to clean a cut on his chin, and the lines around his eyes spoke of years of hard work and worry. But there was something else there now, something that hadn't been in his eyes that first day she'd found him. "Do you know what I like about this place?" she asked. Ted shook his head. "It's honest. The wind doesn't pretend to be gentle when it's fierce. The ground doesn't hide its rocks and holes. Even this old shack doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." Laura gestured at the sagging walls. "After years of my uncle's lies and Philadelphia's false politeness, I find that refreshing." A smile tugged at the corner of Ted's mouth. "You're not what I expected when I wrote that advertisement." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would faint at the first sign of trouble. Someone who would need to be protected from everything difficult or unpleasant." Laura laughed, a sound that surprised them both. "If that's what you wanted, you should have advertised for a China doll, not a wife." This time, Ted's smile was real and broad. "I think Deke would have chewed up a China doll by now." "He's not known for his gentle ways." Laura looked around. "Speaking of Deke, how did he get by through all this?" Ted's expression sobered. "He ran off the night of the fire. Took days before he searched me out here. He was probably scared by the smoke and flames. Dogs are smart about fire." "Smart about most things," Ted agreed. "Deke always could tell when trouble was coming long before I could. He'd start pacing and whining, trying to warn me." Ted's voice grew fond. "That dog has more sense than most men I've known." Laura found herself laughing again. "That's not saying much considering the men I've known." "Oh, and what's wrong with the men you've known?" "Let's see. My uncle was a liar and a manipulator. His business friend was a lecher. The men in and around where I worked were either married and faithless or single and faithless." Laura ticked them off on her fingers. "And the one man I thought might be different turned out to be living under a false name in a broken-down shack." Ted chuckled, a low sound that made something warm curl in Laura's chest. "When you put it like that, Deke really does sound like the best of the lot. At least he's loyal." "That he is." Ted's expression grew serious again. "Laura, I want you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. The fire, the deception, and bringing you into danger. If I could take it back—" "You can't," Laura said firmly. "None of us can change what's already done. We can only decide what to do next." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Laura found herself studying Ted's hands as he ate. They were scarred and calloused from years of metalwork, but there was something graceful about the way he moved them. These were hands that could shape iron and build houses and handle frightened animals with equal skill. Where is Deke? I don't see him about today? Not entirely sure. He hasn't left my side since I holed up here after the fire, until you left yesterday. Haven't seen him since. Just assumed he had things to do. He's been different since you found us. Poor Deke, sitting in this cold place, watching the only person who cares whether he lives or dies, withering away in front of his eyes. No wonder he left you as soon as I made my appearance. He must be so relieved that you are not just his problem now. She made the remark tongue-in-cheek, but Ted looked haunted by her words. He'll be back, was all Ted had to say in response. I should teach you to shoot, Ted said suddenly. Laura blinked. What? A gun. I should teach you to use one. Ted looked at her seriously. If the Redstone men do find me, you need to be able to protect yourself. I don't know anything about guns. That's why you need to learn. Ted stood up carefully, favoring his injured leg. Wait here. He disappeared into the shack and returned with a revolver. It was smaller than Laura had expected, with worn wooden grips and a barrel that gleamed with careful maintenance. This was my brother's, Ted said quietly. He gave it to me before. He stopped and cleared his throat. He'd want it to be put to good use. Laura took the gun hesitantly. It was heavier than she'd expected and cold against her palm. First rule, Ted said, settling back into the doorway. Never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot. Second rule, always assume it's loaded, even when you know it's not. For the next hour, Ted walked Laura through the basics. How to hold the gun, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger slowly instead of jerking it. When he judged her ready, he led her to a spot behind the shack where an old tree stump stood about 20 feet away. Try to hit that, he said, standing behind her. Laura raised the gun, sighted down the barrel the way Ted had shown her, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt several feet to the left of the stump. Again, Ted said patiently. Laura's second shot was even worse. Her third clipped the edge of the stump, sending bark flying. Better, Ted said. You're pulling to the left. Keep your wrists straight. By the time Laura had emptied the cylinder, she'd managed to hit the stump twice more. Her ears were ringing and her arm ached, but she felt oddly proud of herself. I'm terrible at this, she said as Ted reloaded the gun. You're learning. That's different. He handed the gun back to her. Try again. Laura's next round was better. She hit the stump 4 times out of 6 shots, including one that sent splinters flying from dead center. There, Ted said with satisfaction. You're getting the feel of it. Laura lowered the gun and looked at him. Do you really think they'll come here? Ted's expression grew grim. I don't know. I hope not. But if they do, I want you to be ready. They were walking back toward the front of the shack when Laura heard barking in the distance. Ted stopped so suddenly that Laura nearly walked into him. Do you hear that? He asked. The barking came again, closer this time. Then, cresting a small rise about a quarter-mile away, Laura saw a brown and white shape running toward them at full speed. Deke, Ted breathed. The dog reached them in a rush of fur and joy, leaping up to put his paws on Ted's chest. Ted caught him with a laugh that sounded suspiciously close to tears. You old fool, he said, burying his face in the dog's fur. Where have you been? Deke was dirty, with burrs caught in his coat and a shallow cut on one ear, but his tail was wagging so hard his whole body shook, and his brown eyes were bright with happiness. Laura felt her own eyes growing wet as she watched the reunion. This was the first time she'd seen Ted truly smile, the first time he'd looked like the man who'd written those hopeful letters about apple orchards and quiet evenings. He looks like he's been on his own overnight adventure, Laura said. Probably been hunting rabbits and crawling into gullies, Ted said, running his hands over the dog to check for injuries. Smart enough to stay away from town, weren't you, boy? Deke barked once and licked Ted's face. Laura knelt and held out her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Deke sniffed her fingers and allowed her to scratch behind his ears. He seems to accept me better now than before, she said with wonder. Dogs are good judges of character, Ted said. He just had to wait to see that you were going to prove yourself acceptable to him and not disappear or leave me in the lurch. If Deke likes you, that says something. What does it say? Ted looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. that you're someone worth trusting. Later that afternoon, Laura was mending a tear in Ted's shirt when she accidentally pricked her finger with the needle. She gasped and pulled her hand back, watching a drop of blood well up on her fingertip. Before she could react, Ted reached over and caught her hand in his. "Let me see," he said, examining the small wound. His hands were warm and gentle, turning her finger toward the light. The cut was tiny, barely more than a pinprick, but Ted treated it with the same care he might give a serious injury. "It's nothing," Laura said, but she didn't pull her hand away. "Even small wounds can cause trouble if they're not tended," Ted said. He reached for a clean cloth and wrapped it carefully around her finger. Laura found herself studying his face as he worked. The concentration in his blue eyes, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the gentleness of his touch. When he finished with the bandage, he didn't immediately let go of her hand. "Laura," he said quietly. "Yes." For a moment, she thought he was going to say something important, something that would change everything between them. But then Deke chose that moment to bark at a passing hawk, and the spell was broken. Ted released her hand and looked away. "Thank you for everything you've done." Laura nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her finger tingled where he'd touched it, and her heart was beating faster than it should have been. She finished mending his shirt in silence, very carefully, not looking at his hands or his eyes or the way the afternoon light fell across his shoulders. But she was acutely aware of him sitting just a few feet away, and of the way the air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken. When she finally packed up her things to leave, Ted walked her to the edge of the property despite his still healing leg. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked. "Of course." "Good." He paused, then added, "Laura, be careful walking back to town. Keep your eyes open." "You think something's changed?" "I don't know, but Deke has been acting nervous since he got back from wherever it is he has been. That usually means something." Laura looked back at the shack, where Deke was pacing back and forth by the door. "Nervous? Nervous of what?" "Whatever it is that makes smart dogs nervous," Ted said grimly. Laura walked back to Sand Creek with her senses alert and her hand close to the small knife she carried in her pocket. The prairie seemed emptier than usual, and every shadow made her heart jump. But she made it back to town without incident, and that evening she sat in her small room and wrote in her journal. March 8, 1880. Ted is healing well, both in body and spirit. Today, I saw him truly smile for the first time when his dog returned. There are moments when I catch glimpses of the man he was before tragedy changed him, and those glimpses give me hope. But Deke is nervous about something, and Ted is worried. I fear our peaceful days may be coming to an end. Laura closed the journal and prepared for bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Outside her window, the wind again howled across the prairie as she had come to expect, and she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, trouble was riding towards Sand Creek. Chapter 7. Laura was restocking the coffee beans when she heard Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Riley talking in low voices by the fabric counter. "3 of them rode in this morning," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "Big men, well armed, claim they're cattle buyers." "Cattle buyers?" Mrs. Riley snorted. "In March? Before the spring drives? That doesn't make sense." Laura paused in her work, listening carefully while she arranged the sacks of beans. "That's what I thought," Mrs. Henderson continued. "And have you seen the way they look at folks? Like they're sizing everyone up for trouble." "Where are they staying?" "The saloon, I heard. Paid for a week in advance, cash on the barrel." Laura felt a cold knot form in her stomach. 3 strangers, well armed, asking questions. It could be a coincidence, but after everything Ted had told her, she didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Mr. Walsh emerged from the back room carrying a crate of canned peaches. "Ladies, is there something I can help you find?" "Just wondering about those new men in town," Mrs. Riley said. "You heard anything about them, Mr. Walsh?" "Sheriff Granger mentioned them," Mr. Walsh said as he set down the crate. "Says they're looking to buy cattle, maybe start a ranch hereabouts. Seems reasonable enough." "If you say so," Mrs. Henderson said, but she didn't sound convinced. After the women left, Laura finished her work as quickly as possible. She told Mr. Walsh she needed to run an errand and hurried out of the store. The walk to the shack had never felt so long. Laura found herself glancing over her shoulder and jumping at every sound. The peaceful prairie that had become her refuge now felt exposed and dangerous. She found Ted sitting outside the shack, whittling a piece of wood. Deke lay at his feet, but the dog's ears were pricked forward, and his body was tense. "You heard," Ted said without looking up. "Heard what?" "About the strangers." Ted set down his knife and piece of wood. "Deke's been acting nervous all morning. He knows trouble when he smells it." Laura sat down in her usual chair. "Mrs. Henderson says there are 3 of them. They claim to be cattle buyers." "Cattle buyers don't travel in groups of 3, and they don't come to small towns like Sand Creek in March." Ted's voice was grim. "They're here for me. You don't know that for certain." Ted stood up and walked to the ridge behind the shack. From there, he had a clear view of the town and the road leading into it. Laura followed him. "There," Ted said, pointing. Laura squinted into the distance. She could make out 3 figures near the ruins of Ted's old forge. Even from this distance, there was something menacing about the way they moved. "They're looking at the forge," she said. "Looking for clues, signs that the fire wasn't what it seemed." Ted's face had gone pale. "Laura, you need to get back to town. Stay away from here until they're gone." "I'm not leaving you. This isn't a discussion. These men are killers. If they find out you know I'm alive..." Laura watched the distant figures. One of them was tall and thin, moving with a predatory grace that made her skin crawl. Something about him seemed familiar, though she was sure she'd never seen him before. "Who's the tall one?" she asked. Ted followed her gaze and went very still. "Gabe Cranick. You know him? He led the attack on Redstone Gulch." Ted's voice was barely a whisper. "He's the one who gave the order to burn the town." Laura felt ice in her veins. "Then we need to run. Right now. We can take Deke and head north or west to Colorado." "No?" Laura turned to stare at him. "No? I'm done running, Laura. I've been hiding and running for 3 years, and I'm tired of it." Ted's jaw was set in a hard line. "If Cranick wants to finish what he started, he can try, but I won't abandon Sand Creek the way I abandoned Redstone Gulch." "This is different. The people here don't even know you're alive. You don't owe them anything. I owe them the truth, and I owe myself the chance to face this without running away again." Laura grabbed his arm. "Ted, please. You said yourself these men are killers. They won't give you a fair fight. They'll just shoot you down and be done with it." Ted looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. There was fear in his eyes, but also something else. Something that looked like peace. "Maybe," he said, "but at least I'll die as myself, not as some shadow hiding in the grass." Laura wanted to argue with him, to make him see reason, but she could see it would be useless. Whatever had broken inside Ted 3 years ago when his brother died had finally started to heal, and part of that healing meant standing his ground. They walked back to the shack in silence. The afternoon sun was getting lower, and the air was growing cold. "What's your plan?" Laura asked finally. "I don't have one yet. Wait and see what they do. Try to keep them away from innocent people." "That's not a plan. That's a prayer." Ted almost smiled. "Sometimes prayers are all you have." They sat outside the shack as the sun set, neither talking much. Laura found herself leaning against Ted's shoulder without really thinking about it. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted slightly to make her more comfortable. Deke lay at their feet, his brown eyes watchful. Every now and then, his ears would twitch and he'd raise his head, listening to sounds only he could hear. "Laura," Ted said quietly. "Yes? If something happens to me, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the best I've had in years." Laura felt tears prick her eyes. "Nothing's going to happen to you." "You don't know that." "Then we'll make sure it doesn't." Laura sat up straighter. "You're not the only one who's tired of running and hiding. Maybe it's time to fight back." Ted looked at her in surprise. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about not letting 3 killers terrorize an entire town. I'm talking about standing up to bullies, which is something I should have done a long time ago." "Laura, these aren't Philadelphia society ladies gossiping about your reputation. These are professional killers." "I know that." Laura's voice was steady. "But I also know that you're a good man who doesn't deserve to die for doing the right thing. And I know that I'd rather die fighting beside you than live hiding from the truth." Ted stared at her for a long moment. You mean that? Every word. Something passed between them in the growing darkness. An understanding, a commitment that went deeper than words. Laura felt it settle into her bones like warmth from a fire. All right, Ted said finally. If you're determined to stay, then we need to prepare. The next morning, Laura arrived at the shack to find Ted practicing with his revolver. He'd set up targets at various distances and was methodically shooting at each one. His movements were smooth and precise, nothing like the broken man she'd found weeks ago. You're good at this, Laura said, watching him reload. I used to be better. Ted fired 6 quick shots, hitting 5 of the 6 targets. 3 years of hiding doesn't help a man's aim. What else do we need to prepare? Ted walked over to a pile of metal pieces he'd been working on. I've been making some tools. A hammer with a longer handle for close fighting. Some metal spikes we can set around the shack as traps. Laura looked at the items he'd forged. You think they'll come here? Eventually. Cranach is smart and patient. He'll investigate the town, ask questions, look for inconsistencies in the story of my death. When he doesn't find what he's looking for there, he'll start searching the surrounding area. How long do we have? A few days, maybe a week if we're lucky. Laura watched Ted practice shooting for a while longer. His face was calm and focused, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. This was costing him more than he wanted to admit. That evening, after she'd returned to town, Laura sat in her small room and began writing a letter. She wrote carefully, choosing each word with precision. Sheriff Granger, she began. I have reason to believe that Sand Creek may be in danger from the 3 strangers who arrived recently. I cannot explain how I know this, but I urge you to watch them carefully and be prepared for trouble. A concerned citizen. She read the letter over twice, then folded it and hid it in her sewing basket. She wasn't sure if she would ever send it, but having it written made her feel slightly better. Outside her window, the wind howled across the prairie, and Laura found herself thinking about Ted alone in that cold shack with only Deke for company. She thought about the fear in his eyes when he'd recognized Gabe Cranach, and the determined set of his jaw when he'd refused to run. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Laura had lost too much in her life to lose Ted now, especially when she was just beginning to understand how much he meant to her. She blew out her candle and tried to sleep, but rest was a long time coming. Somewhere out there, 3 killers were planning their next move, and somewhere else, the man she cared about was preparing to make his last stand. Laura stared at the ceiling and made her own plans. If Gabe Cranach thought he could finish what he'd started in Missouri, he was about to learn that Kansas had its own brand of fight. The next few days would test everything Laura had learned about courage and determination. She only hoped it would be enough. Chapter 8. Laura was sweeping the front steps of the general store when she heard the screaming. A woman was running down the main street, her skirts bunched in her fists and her hair flying loose from its pins. Laura recognized her as Mrs. Miller, a young widow who lived in a small house near the creek. "Help," Mrs. Miller cried. "Someone help me. Toby's gone." Laura dropped her broom and ran toward the woman. Sheriff Granger emerged from his office at the same time, his face grave with concern. "Mrs. Miller, slow down," the sheriff said, catching her by the shoulders. "Tell us what happened." "Toby didn't come home last night," Mrs. Miller sobbed. "He took his pony to the creek yesterday afternoon, like he always does, but he never came back. I waited all night, thinking maybe he'd stopped at the Henderson place, but when I went there this morning..." She broke off, unable to continue. Laura felt ice forming in her stomach. Toby Miller was about 10 years old, a sandy-haired boy who helped his mother with odd jobs around town. Everyone knew him. He was the kind of child who would never stay out all night without telling his mother. "Did you check the creek?" Sheriff Granger asked. "First place I looked, found his pony grazing by the water, but no sign of Toby." Mrs. Miller wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Sheriff, I'm scared. What if he fell into the water? What if something happened to him?" "We'll find him," Sheriff Granger said firmly. "I'll get some men together and we'll search every inch of the area." Laura's mind was racing. 3 dangerous men had arrived in town just days ago. Men who Ted said were killers. Now a young boy had disappeared, It couldn't be a coincidence. Mrs. Miller, Laura said gently, did anyone see Toby yesterday? Anyone you haven't talked to yet? I don't know. I've been so worried I can barely think straight. Sheriff Granger was already organizing a search party. Laura watched the men gathering, talking in low voices about where to look and how to divide up the territory. But she had a terrible feeling they wouldn't find anything at the creek. I need to check on something, Laura told Mr. Walsh, who had come outside to see what the commotion was about. Of course, go on. Laura hurried through town toward the ruins of Ted's old forge. If the strangers had taken Toby, they might have left some kind of message. It's what men like that did, according to Ted. They used fear as a weapon. The forge site was at the edge of town, a blackened scar of burned timbers and twisted metal. Laura approached it slowly, her eyes scanning the ground for anything unusual. There, tied to a piece of charred wood that stuck up from the ruins like a grave marker, was a piece of red cloth. Laura's blood turned cold as she got closer and saw what was written on a board propped against the debris. The letters were crude, carved with a knife. "Come out, Reaves, or the boy dies next." Laura stared at the message, her heart hammering. They knew. Somehow, the Redstone men had figured out that Ted was still alive, and they had taken an innocent child to force him into the open. She looked around quickly to make sure no one was watching, then pulled the red cloth from the post and shoved it into her pocket. The message board she left where it was. Sheriff Granger would find it soon enough when the search party expanded its area. Laura ran back to the general store and grabbed her shawl. "Mr. Walsh, I need to go out for a while. Family business." "Laura, is everything all right? You look pale as a sheet." "I'll be fine. I just need to take care of something urgent." Laura hurried out of town, her feet carrying her automatically toward the path to Ted's shack. She needed to warn him, needed to tell him what had happened. But she also knew what his reaction would be. He would want to give himself up to save Toby. She found Ted behind the shack, practicing with his revolver. At the sound of her footsteps, he turned, and his face went white at her expression. "What's wrong?" "They took him," Laura said, breathing hard from her run. "They took Toby Miller." Ted's face went very still. "Tell me everything." Laura explained about Mrs. Miller's frantic search, about the message at the forge ruins. She pulled the red cloth from her pocket and showed it to him. "This was tied to a post," she said, "and there was a message carved on a board. 'Come out, Reaves, or the boy dies next,' was all it said." Ted took the cloth and examined it. His hands were steady, but Laura could see a muscle jumping in his jaw. "They know you're alive," she said. "Yes. How? Does it matter?" Ted looked at her with eyes that were calm but filled with pain. "They have an innocent child, Laura. A boy who's done nothing wrong. What are you going to do?" Ted was quiet for a long moment, staring at the red cloth. "What I should have done 3 years ago. Face them. That's suicide, maybe, but I won't let them hurt Toby because of me." Ted tucked the cloth into his shirt pocket. "I'm going to give myself up." "No." Laura grabbed his arm. "There has to be another way." "What other way?" "They have a hostage. If I don't show myself, they'll kill him." Laura felt panic rising in her chest. After everything they'd been through, after all the progress Ted had made in healing, she wasn't going to let him throw his life away. "Wait," she said. "Just wait. Let me think." She pulled the letter she'd written to Sheriff Granger from her pocket. "I wrote this yesterday, a warning about the strangers." Ted read it quickly. "You should have sent it already." "I will, right now, and I'll tell him about the message." Laura looked at Ted seriously. "Sheriff Granger is a good man. He'll help us. This isn't his fight. It became his fight the moment they took a child from his town." Laura folded the letter carefully. "Promise me you won't do anything until I get back. Give me a chance to talk to the sheriff." Ted shook his head. "Laura, you don't understand. These men don't negotiate. They don't compromise. They take what they want through force and fear. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are." "We?" Laura lifted her chin. "Yes, we. I'm not letting you face them alone. Absolutely not. I won't have you anywhere near this. You don't get to make that choice for me." Laura's voice was fierce. "I've been making my own choices for months now, and I'm not going to stop because things got dangerous." Ted stared at her for a moment, then ran a hand through his hair. Laura, we have been over this before. The difference between these professional killers and the likes of the Philadelphia society ladies you are accustomed to standing up to. Yes, Ted, we have. And yes, I do know there is a difference. But I also know that you have advantages they don't expect. Laura began pacing, her mind working. They think you're a broken man hiding in the wilderness. They don't know you've been preparing. They don't know you have help. What kind of help? You can barely hit a tree stump at 20 feet. I can do more than shoot. Laura stopped pacing and looked at him. I can sew, Ted. I can make things, and you can forge metal. Between the two of us, we can make weapons they won't see coming. Ted was quiet, and Laura could see him considering her words. What did you have in mind? He asked finally. Laura felt a surge of hope. Remember those chemicals you had left over from the forge? The ones you used to harden steel? Saltpeter and charcoal. What about them? Combined with the right materials, they make excellent flash charges, small explosions that can blind and confuse an enemy. Laura had read about such things in one of the books from the lending library. If we could make several of them, hide them around the forge ruins. An ambush, Ted said slowly. Not just any ambush, one where we control the terrain and the timing. Laura felt her confidence growing. You said these men are used to intimidating people through fear. But what if their target doesn't act afraid? What if he acts like he's in control? Ted was looking at her with something like admiration. You're serious about this. Deadly serious. It's dangerous. If something goes wrong, if we miscalculate, then at least we'll go down fighting instead of hiding. Laura met his eyes. I'd rather die beside you in a fair fight than live knowing I let you sacrifice yourself alone. Ted was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. All right, but first, you take that letter to Sheriff Granger. Tell him everything. If he can get some deputies together, we might have a real chance. Laura kissed his cheek quickly, surprising them both. I'll be back as soon as I can. She ran most of the way back to town, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. Sheriff Granger was at his office, organizing the search for Toby. Sheriff, Laura said, pushing through the door. I need to talk to you. Privately. Granger looked up from his map. Miss Sutton, did you find something? Laura pulled out her letter and handed it to him. I wrote this yesterday. I should have brought it to you then. The sheriff read the letter, his expression growing more serious with each word. You have reason to believe Sand Creek is in danger? What kind of reason? The kind that involves a message carved at the forge ruins. Come out, Reaves, or the boy dies next. Sheriff Granger went very still. Reaves? But Ted Reaves is dead. Laura took a deep breath. No, Sheriff, he's not. Over the next 10 minutes, Laura told Sheriff Granger everything. About finding Ted at the shack, about his past with the Redstone men, about the 3 strangers who had come to town looking for him. The sheriff listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. So, the boy was taken to draw Reaves out of hiding, he said when she finished. Yes, and if we don't do something, they'll kill Toby just to prove they can. Sheriff Granger stood up and reached for his gun belt. Where is Reaves now? At his hiding place. But, Sheriff, he's planning to give himself up to save Toby. We have to stop him. Why would we want to stop him, if he's the one they want? Because it won't end there, Laura said urgently. These men are killers. Even if Ted surrenders, they'll still murder Toby to eliminate witnesses, and probably anyone else who knows the truth. Sheriff Granger considered this. What do you propose? Ted and I have a plan, but we need your help. The sheriff listened as Laura outlined their idea for an ambush at the forge ruins. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. It's risky, he said finally. So is doing nothing. I can get 2 deputies, maybe 3, but if these men are as dangerous as you say... They're used to fighting frightened farmers, ranchers, and shopkeepers, Laura said. They're not used to fighting soldiers. You served in the war, didn't you? Sheriff Granger nodded slowly. I did. Then you know about tactics and planning. Help us, Sheriff. Help us save Toby and end this threat to your town. After what felt like an eternity, Sheriff Granger stood up. All right, Miss Sutton, let's go talk to this supposedly dead blacksmith of yours. Laura was back at the shack by late afternoon, with Sheriff Granger and 2 deputies following at a distance. She found Ted working with grim efficiency, mixing chemicals and packing them into small cloth pouches. Flash charges, he explained to the sheriff. Laura's idea. They'll create noise and confusion without bringing down any buildings. Sheriff Granger examined one of the devices. Clever. How many can you make? 6, maybe 8 if we work through the night. We'll need them placed strategically around the forge ruins, Laura said, and we'll need a way to set them off at the right moment. For the next several hours, they planned and prepared. Laura used her sewing skills to create the cloth pouches for the charges, while Ted forged metal spikes and sharpened his tools. Sheriff Granger and his deputies scouted the terrain around the forge, looking for the best positions for an ambush. After night fell, Laura found herself sitting beside Ted outside the shack, both exhausted but too nervous to sleep. Tomorrow they would put their plan into action. Tomorrow they would either save Toby Miller or die trying. Laura, Ted said quietly, yes, I want you to know that these past few weeks, getting to know you, have been the best part of my life since Tom died. Laura felt tears prick her eyes. Don't talk like we're going to die tomorrow. I hope we don't, but if something happens to me, Laura turned to face him. Nothing's going to happen to you. We're going to win, and we're going to save Toby, and then we're going to build that apple orchard you wrote about in your letters. Ted looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something soft and wonderful and full of hope. Laura, he said again, and this time there was something different in his voice. Before she could answer, Ted reached out and cupped her face in his hands. For a moment, they just looked at each other in the dim light from the shack's window. Then he kissed her. It was nothing like the polite, passionless kisses Uncle Harold's business associates had tried to steal in Philadelphia. This was warm and firm and full of everything Ted couldn't say with words. Fear and hope and determination and something deeper that made Laura's heart race. When they broke apart, Laura rested her forehead against his. What was that for? She whispered. In case I don't get another chance, Ted said quietly. Laura felt a fierce surge of determination. You'll get another chance. I promise you that. She kissed him back, brief but sure, sealing the promise between them. Tomorrow would bring danger and uncertainty. But tonight, for just a few stolen moments, Laura allowed herself to believe that they had a future worth fighting for. Chapter 9. Laura and Ted arrived at the forge ruins before dawn, moving quietly through the gray light. The charred remains of the building looked even more desolate in the early morning, like the bones of some great beast picked clean by scavengers. Here, Ted said, pointing to a section of collapsed wall. This will give you cover and a clear view of the approach from town. Laura knelt behind the blackened stones and peered over the top. She could see the main road clearly, as well as most of the open ground around the forge. It was a good position, but it made her stomach clench with nerves. Where will you be? She asked. There. Ted pointed to a pile of twisted metal and charred timbers about 30 feet away. Close enough to strike quickly, far enough that they won't spot me right away. Laura unpacked the flash charges they'd prepared during the night. 8 small cloth pouches, each one filled with a carefully measured mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and metal shavings. She placed them at strategic points around the ruins, hiding them behind debris and covering them with ash and dirt. Remember, Ted said as they worked, wait for my signal before you light the first one, and once the shooting starts, keep your head down. I know, Laura's voice was steadier than she felt. We've been over this. Ted handed her his brother's revolver and a powder horn. 6 shots, then you'll need to reload. Can you do it fast enough? Laura checked the cylinder and tucked the gun into her belt. I practiced last night while you were sleeping. Good. Ted pulled his own revolver and checked it carefully. Laura, if something goes wrong, if this doesn't work the way we planned, it will work. But if it doesn't, I want you to run. Don't try to help me. Don't try to be heroic. Just run as fast as you can back to town. Laura looked at him seriously. I'm not leaving you. Laura, I said I'm not leaving you. We do this together or not at all. Ted stared at her for a moment, then nodded. Together. Now we wait, he said quietly. They finished placing the charges while the sun climbed higher. Laura settled into her hiding spot behind the ruined wall, the loaded pistol heavy in her hands. Ted melted into the shadows among the twisted metal, becoming almost invisible. They had made the decision to secure Deke in the shack. They could not be sure that he would not be a liability when the action started, and no one wanted to see him hurt. Laura lay flat behind the stones, watching the road. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure it could be heard for miles. Every sound made her jump. A bird landing on the debris, the wind rattling through the ruins, her own breathing which seemed unnaturally loud. Time moved like cold honey. Laura watched the sun rise, watched the shadows shift across the burned ground. Her back ached from lying still and her palms were slick with sweat. Then, around midday, she saw Ted stand up. "It's time," he said simply. Laura watched him walk toward town, moving openly down the main road like a man with nothing to hide. He looked calm, confident, even a little defiant. This was the Ted from his letters, the man who dreamed of apple orchards and quiet evenings, the man who'd refused to run anymore. From her hiding spot, Laura could see people in town pointing and talking. Word would spread quickly. Within an hour, everyone in Sand Creek would know that Ted Reaves was alive and walking freely through their streets. Laura settled back behind the wall and waited. The sun was getting low when she finally saw them coming. 3 riders approaching from town, moving at a steady pace but not hurrying. Even from a distance, Laura could see that these were dangerous men. They sat their horses like soldiers, alert and ready for trouble. Ted emerged from his hiding place and walked to the center of the forge ruins. He stood there calmly, his hands at his sides, waiting for them to reach him. The riders stopped about 50 feet away. The tall, thin man in the middle dismounted and walked closer. Laura recognized him from Ted's description. Gabe Cranach. Up close, he looked even more menacing than she'd imagined. His face was sharp and cruel, with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. "Well, well," Cranach said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The famous Ted Reaves, back from the dead." "Cranach." Ted's voice was steady. "You're a long way from Missouri. So are you. But then you always were good at running away." "I'm done running," Cranach laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Are you now? That's interesting, because I was hoping you'd run. It makes the hunt more fun. Where's the boy?" "Safe, for now." Cranach gestured to one of his men, who rode back toward an old barn about a quarter-mile away. "He'll stay that way as long as you cooperate." "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. To finish what we started in Redstone Gulch." Cranach drew his gun, a long-barreled Colt that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "You cost me a lot of money when you stirred up trouble with Barrett. Time to pay the bill." Ted's hand moved toward his own gun, but stopped when Cranach's companion drew his weapon as well. Now," Cranach said, "let's not be hasty. Drop your gun belt. Kick it away." Ted hesitated, then slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall. He kicked it toward the edge of the ruins. Laura felt her heart sink. This wasn't how they'd planned it. Ted was supposed to keep them talking longer, giving her time to get into position. But Cranach was moving too fast, too smart to fall for a simple trap. "Good," Cranach said. "Now, you're going to tell me exactly who else knows you're alive. And then you're going to watch while I kill them one by one. Nobody else knows." "Liar." Cranach backhanded Ted across the face, sending him stumbling. "That girl at the general store, the one who's been asking questions about cattle buyers. She knows, doesn't she?" Laura's blood turned to ice. They'd been watching her. "Leave her out of this," Ted said, blood trickling from his split lip. "So, she does know." Cranach smiled, showing gold teeth. "Don't worry. I'll find her after I'm done with you. Maybe I'll take my time with her." That was when Laura lit the first flash charge. The explosion wasn't large, but in the quiet of the prairie evening, it sounded like thunder. A burst of white light and smoke erupted from behind a pile of debris, temporarily blinding the 3 men. Laura used the confusion to light 2 more charges in quick succession, the ruins filled with smoke and the sharp smell of burned gunpowder. Ted dove for his gun belt as Cranach and his men tried to figure out what was happening. The leader was shouting orders, but his voice was lost in the ringing echoes of the explosions. One of Cranach's men fired wildly into the smoke, the bullet striking the wall inches from Laura's head. Stone chips peppered her face, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could see the man who'd shot at her, partially hidden behind his spooked horse. Laura raised the revolver, aimed as carefully as Ted had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked in her hands, and the bullet hit the man's boot exactly as she had intended. He dropped like a rock, sending his weapon flying out of his reach. Laura stared at him, shocked and equally impressed that she had found her mark, unable to believe she'd actually hit her target. Her hands were shaking as she forced herself to reload, just as she'd practiced. The sound of gunfire was deafening now, echoing off the ruins as Ted and Cranach exchanged shots. Through the smoke, Laura saw Ted roll behind a fallen beam as Cranach's remaining companion tried to get a clear shot at him. Laura aimed at the second gunman and fired again. This shot went wide, but it was close enough to make him duck for cover. She reloaded again, her fingers fumbling with the bullets. This was nothing like target practice. Nothing like shooting at tree stumps in the quiet morning air. The smoke was beginning to clear when Laura saw Cranach advancing on Ted's position. The gang leader had lost his hat, and his face was streaked with soot, but his eyes were bright with fury. "Come out, Reaves," he shouted. "Face me like a man." Ted stood up slowly, his hands empty. "I'm here." "You think you're clever with your little fireworks show? You think that changes anything?" Cranach raised his gun. "You're still going to die, and then I'm going to find that girl of yours and—" Ted moved faster than Laura had ever seen him move. Instead of going for a gun, he lunged forward with the long-handled hammer he'd forged, swinging it in a wide arc. The hammer caught Cranach in the side, sending him stumbling. Cranach's shot went wild, the bullet whistling harmlessly past Ted's ear. The two men grappled in the dirt among the ruins, fighting for control of Cranach's gun. They were both strong, but Cranach was younger and meaner. He got on top of Ted and wrapped his hands around his throat. Laura could see Ted's face turning red as Cranach squeezed. Without thinking, she stood up from behind the wall and fired at Cranach's back. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He lost his grip on Ted's throat and rolled away, clutching his wounded arm. Ted gasped for air and reached for his hammer. Cranach was trying to reach his fallen gun with his good hand when Ted brought the hammer down hard on his skull. Cranach collapsed and didn't move again. The sudden silence was deafening. Laura could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the acrid smoke of the flash charges mixed with the metallic scent of blood. "Ted?" she called. "I'm all right." Ted pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. "Are you hurt?" "No, Laura looked at the two men she'd shot. One was clearly in pain, the other groaning and trying to crawl away despite a shattered shoulder. "I can't believe I actually hit them." "You did good." Ted walked over to check on Cranach, who was breathing but unconscious. "Better than good. You saved my life." That was when they heard the sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Laura's heart clenched, thinking there might be more of Cranach's men. But then she saw Sheriff Granger's badge glinting in the late afternoon sun. "About time," Ted said with a weak smile. Sheriff Granger and two deputies rode into the ruins, their guns drawn and ready. They took in the scene quickly. The unconscious Cranach, the wounded gunman, Ted and Laura standing among the smoke and debris. "Well," Sheriff Granger said, dismounting, "looks like you two handled things pretty well without us." "Is Toby safe?" Laura asked. Deputy Morrison found him in the old Miller barn, tied up but unhurt. Sheriff Granger walked over to examine Cranach. "This the man who's been causing all the trouble?" "That's him," Ted said. "Gabe Cranach. There should be wanted posters all around for him out of Missouri." "I'll check on that." Sheriff Granger gestured to his deputies, who began securing the prisoners. "In the meantime, I think you two have some explaining to do." Laura looked at Ted, suddenly aware that their secret was out. The whole town would know the truth now. Ted Reaves was alive, and she'd been hiding him. But as she watched the sheriff and his men work, Laura felt no fear, only relief that it was finally over. "Sheriff," Ted said formally, "I'm sorry for the deception. I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can." Sheriff Granger looked from Ted to Laura and back again. "But right now, let's just get these men back to town and locked up. The explanations can wait until tomorrow." After the deputies loaded the prisoners onto horses and headed back toward Sand Creek, Laura found herself standing alone with Ted among the ruins of his old forge. "It's over," she said quietly. "Yes." Ted looked around at the charred beams and twisted metal. "Finally over." "What happens now?" Ted took her hand, his fingers warm and steady despite everything they'd been through. "Now we start again, together." Laura squeezed his hand and smiled. For the first time since she'd stepped off the train in Sand Creek, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. "But first, we give Deke his liberty." Laura smiled, and they turned to head to the shack and the brave dog who would be happier to see them than anyone they knew. Soon enough, the sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, silhouetting a man, a woman, and a dog. Tomorrow would bring questions and decisions and the work of rebuilding. But tonight, Laura allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. They had fought for each other and won. Everything else would work itself out in time. Chapter 10. The news spread through Sand Creek like wildfire. By morning, everyone in town knew that Ted Reaves was alive, that the Redstone men had been captured, and that Laura Sutton had fought beside him in the ruins of the old forge. People gathered in small groups on street corners, talking in hushed voices about the shootout and the rescue of young Toby Miller. Laura woke in her small room above the general store to find Mr. Walsh knocking on her door. "Laura, there's quite a crowd downstairs asking about you." She dressed quickly and came down to find the store filled with townsfolk. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Riley, even Mrs. Vance were there, all looking at Laura with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Is it true?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "About Ted Reaves being alive all this time?" Laura straightened her shoulders. "Yes, it's true. And you knew?" Mrs. Vance's voice carried its usual edge of suspicion. "I found out a few weeks ago. He was injured and hiding because those men were hunting him." "So, you've been lying to all of us," Mrs. Vance continued. Laura felt her cheeks burn, but before she could answer, Mrs. Riley spoke up. "She saved that boy's life," the older woman said firmly. "From what I heard, Laura shot 2 armed men to protect Toby and Ted. That takes more courage than most of us have." "It's true," said a voice from the back of the crowd. Sheriff Granger pushed through the group, his hat in his hands. "Miss Sutton acted with remarkable bravery. If she hadn't been there, we might have lost both Ted and young Toby." Laura looked at the sheriff gratefully. "How is Toby?" "Shaken but unharmed. He's asking for Ted, actually. Wants to thank him for coming to rescue him." The crowd began to disperse, people heading off to their daily work with new stories to share. Mrs. Vance left without another word, but several other women approached Laura before going. "If you need anything," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "you just let us know." After the store emptied, Sheriff Granger lingered. "Miss Sutton, I need to ask you to come to the church this afternoon. I'm making a formal statement about what happened, and I'd like you and Ted to be there." Laura's stomach tightened. What kind of statement? The kind that clears his name once and for all. The territorial marshal confirmed that Gabe Cranach was wanted for murder in 3 states. Ted Reaves is a victim, not a criminal. That afternoon, Laura found herself standing beside Ted in front of the small congregation that had gathered inside the church. Most of the town was there, curious faces looking up at them from the wooden pews. Sheriff Granger stood at the front, holding a piece of paper. "Folks, I want to set the record straight about recent events," he began. "Ted Reaves is not a criminal. He's a man who stood up to a gang of killers in Missouri and paid a terrible price for it. When they came here hunting him, he could have run again. Instead, he stayed and fought to protect our town and our children." The sheriff looked directly at Ted. "The territorial marshal has confirmed that all charges against you in Missouri were dropped 2 years ago. You're a free man, Mr. Reaves, and Sand Creek is lucky to have you." A murmur ran through the crowd. Laura saw people nodding, heard someone in the back say, "Good for him." Furthermore, Sheriff Granger continued, Miss Sutton showed remarkable courage in helping to rescue young Toby Miller. This town owes both of them a debt of gratitude. When the brief service ended, people approached to shake Ted's hand and express their gratitude. Laura was surprised by how warmly they received him. She'd expected suspicion, maybe even hostility. Instead, she saw respect and gratitude. Old Mr. Patterson, who owned the largest ranch in the area, clapped Ted on the shoulder. "Been needing a good blacksmith for months. My tools are falling apart. Would you be interested in some work? I don't have a forge anymore, Ted said. Then we'll help you build one, Patterson replied. Town needs a smithy. The next morning, Laura walked out to the ruins of the old forge to find Ted already there, sorting through the debris. He looked up as she approached. Thought I'd start clearing this away, he said. See what can be salvaged. I'll help. Laura, you don't need to. I want to. Laura picked up a twisted piece of metal and examined it. Some of this iron could still be useful. They worked together in comfortable silence, sorting through the wreckage. Laura found it oddly peaceful, working beside Ted in the morning sunshine. This felt right in a way her old life in Philadelphia never had. By noon, they'd made good progress. Laura had piled the salvageable metal in one area, while Ted cleared away the burned timber and broken stone. Her dress was dirty, and her hands were grimy, but she felt more useful than she had in months. Laura. She looked up to find Mrs. Eaton approaching with a basket over her arm. Thought you two might be hungry, the older woman said, setting the basket down. It's hard work clearing all this. Thank you, Laura said, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Eaton looked around at their progress. You're making good headway. At this rate, you'll have space for a new forge by next week. Laura and Ted sat in the shade to eat the sandwiches Mrs. Eaton had brought. As they ate, more people began arriving. Mr. Patterson came with a wagon and two of his ranch hands. Other men from town appeared with tools and lumber. What's all this? Ted asked. Community effort, Patterson said gruffly. Can't have our blacksmith working without proper tools. Within an hour, half the town seemed to be involved in clearing the site. Men hauled away debris, while women brought food and water. Children ran around getting in the way and being scolded by their mothers. Laura found herself working beside Mrs. Eaton, stacking usable stones for the new foundation. You've got a good man there, Mrs. Eaton said quietly, nodding toward Ted. Laura felt her cheeks warm. Mrs. Eaton, oh, don't try to deny it. I've got eyes. The way you two look at each other, the way you fought together. Mrs. Eaton smiled. Most men would have kept running when trouble found them, but not him. He stayed and fought for this town. That says something about his character. Laura looked over at Ted, who was directing the placement of a heavy beam. He's been through so much, lost so much. Haven't you both? But look at you now, building something new together. Laura couldn't deny the truth in Mrs. Eaton's words. Working beside Ted, surrounded by neighbors who had accepted them both, she felt like she was finally building the life she'd always wanted. By late afternoon, the site was cleared and the foundation for a new forge had been laid. Ted stood in the center of it, looking stunned by how much had been accomplished. We'll have the walls up by the end of the week, Patterson promised. Can't have you working out of that old shack much longer. As the crowd began to disperse, Ted approached Sheriff Granger. Sheriff, I want to thank you for everything you did and for what you said at the church. No need for thanks. I just told the truth. Granger looked around at the construction site. Looks like you'll be staying in Sand Creek. If the town will have me, I think you can count on that. 2 days later, Ted sought Laura out at the general store. Would you like to come into town with me? He asked. I need to pick up some supplies, and I wanted to thank Sheriff Granger properly. Laura looked at Mr. Walsh, who waved her away with a smile. Go on. Business is slow today anyway. They walked through town together, and Laura noticed how people greeted them. Not as strangers or outcasts, but as neighbors, as a couple. At the sheriff's office, Ted shook Granger's hand again. I know I've said this before, but I want you to know how grateful I am. For believing Laura, for organizing the rescue, for clearing my name. Like I said, just doing my job. Sheriff Granger leaned back in his chair. But I'm glad things worked out. Sand Creek is better with you here. They stopped at the general store to pick up nails and other supplies for the new forge. Mr. Walsh tallied up the purchases, while other customers nodded politely to Laura and Ted. Quite a change from a few weeks ago, Ted said quietly as they walked home. People here are good, Laura replied. They just needed to understand the truth. That evening, they sat outside the old shack, watching the sunset. The new forge was already taking shape, its wooden frame rising against the prairie sky. Laura, Ted said suddenly, I need to tell you something. She looked at him, noting the serious expression on his face. "What is it? Before all this happened, before you came to Sand Creek, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to hide and survive." Ted took her hand. "But these past few weeks, working with you, fighting beside you, building something together, it's made me remember who I used to be, who I want to be again." Laura felt tears prick her eyes. "Ted, I never thought I'd believe in love," she said quietly. "Not real love, anyway. In Philadelphia, marriage was just a business arrangement, a way for men to acquire property and for women to survive. And now," Laura looked at their joined hands, at the calluses they'd both earned through honest work. "Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe what we've built here, this partnership, this trust, maybe that's what love actually is." Ted lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You didn't find love, Laura. You built it. We built it. Together." Laura leaned against his shoulder and watched the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow would bring more work on the forge, more challenges as they figured out their life together. But tonight, she was content to sit beside the man she loved and watch the stars come out over the Kansas prairie. For the first time since she'd left Philadelphia, Laura felt like she was exactly where she belonged, because she'd chosen to be right there, because she'd fought for it, because she'd built it with her own hands and her own courage. The girl who'd been thrown out of her uncle's house would barely recognize the woman she'd become. And that, Laura thought with satisfaction, was exactly as it should be. Chapter 11. The new forge was finally ready. Laura stood in the doorway, watching Ted test the bellows and adjust the placement of his tools. The building smelled of fresh wood and iron, so different from the charred ruins they'd cleared away just 2 weeks ago. "It's beautiful," she said. Ted looked up from the anvil he was positioning. "It's functional. That's what matters." But Laura could see the pride in his eyes as he surveyed his new workspace. The town had built him something better than he'd lost. Bigger, sturdier, with proper ventilation and storage. It was a blacksmith's dream. "The horseshoes Mr. Patterson ordered are finished," Laura said, pointing to a neat row of iron shoes she'd helped hammer into shape. "I laid them out on the workbench." "Thank you." Ted wiped his hands on his leather apron and walked over to examine her work. "These are good. You're getting better at keeping the curve even." Laura felt a flush of pride. She'd been helping Ted in the forge for days now, learning to work the metal and tend the fire. Her hands were rough with calluses and her arms ached from swinging the hammer, but she loved the work. There was something satisfying about shaping iron into something useful. Ted picked up one of the horseshoes and turned it over in his hands. Then he set it down and reached into his pocket. "Laura," he said quietly, "there's something I want to ask you." She looked up from organizing the tools and saw something different in his expression. Nervousness, maybe, or hope. "What is it?" Instead of answering, Ted picked up the horseshoe again. This time, Laura noticed something she'd missed before. A piece of blue ribbon was tied around the iron, and nestled in the curve of the shoe was a small silver ring. Laura's heart stopped. "I know this isn't very romantic," Ted said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not good with fancy words or grand gestures, but I made this ring myself, and I thought—" He stopped and took a breath. "Laura, will you marry me?" Laura stared at the ring, her eyes filling with tears. It was simple and beautiful, the silver polished to a soft gleam. She could see the tiny marks where Ted had shaped it with his own hands. "You made this?" "From silver coins I've been saving. I melted them down and forged it myself." Ted's hands were shaking slightly as he untied the ribbon. "I know it's not much, but it's perfect." Laura looked up at him through her tears. "It's absolutely perfect." "Is that a yes?" Laura laughed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Yes, of course it's yes." She paused, then grinned. "But only if we keep Deke the dog inside during the ceremony." Ted's face broke into the widest smile Laura had ever seen from him. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her, which, she realized, it had been. "I love you, Laura Sutton," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I love you too, Ted Reaves." They kissed in the new forge, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the smell of honest work. Laura felt like her heart might burst with happiness. "When?" she asked when they broke apart. "When what?" When do you want to get married? Ted considered this. Soon. I don't want to wait any longer than we have to. Neither do I. They walked into town that afternoon to share their news. Their first stop was the general store, where Mr. Walsh was tallying up accounts behind the counter. Mr. Walsh, Laura said, barely able to contain her excitement. Ted and I have an announcement. The older man looked up, took one look at their joined hands and Laura's bright smile, and broke into a grin of his own. Well, it's about time, he said. When's the wedding? We haven't set a date yet, Ted said. Soon, though, Laura added. Good, good. Mr. Walsh came around the counter to shake Ted's hand. You're getting a fine woman, Ted, and Laura, you're getting a good man. Word spread quickly through Sand Creek. By evening, it seemed like half the town had stopped by to congratulate them. Mrs. Eaton arrived with a basket of food and tears of joy in her eyes. I knew it, she said, hugging Laura tightly. I knew from the first time I saw you two together that this would happen. Sheriff Granger appeared shortly after, his hat in his hands and a rare smile on his face. Congratulations, he said formally. If you need someone to perform the ceremony, I'm authorized to do marriages. We'd be honored, Ted said, shaking the sheriff's hand. I insist on standing as a witness, Sheriff Granger continued. After everything we've been through together, I think I've earned the right. Even Mrs. Vance stopped by, though her congratulations were somewhat more reserved. I suppose you'll be moving out of the room above the store, she said to Laura. Yes, I expect so. Mrs. Vance nodded stiffly. Well, I hope you'll be happy. It wasn't effusive, but coming from Mrs. Vance, Laura counted it as a blessing. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Laura worked on her wedding dress in the evenings, sewing by lamplight in her small room. She'd chosen a sturdy, pale blue muslin, practical enough for frontier life, but pretty enough for a wedding. She embroidered small flowers around the neckline and sleeves, remembering the sewing lessons Aunt Margaret had given her years ago. Ted, meanwhile, was making his own preparations. He trimmed his beard shorter than Laura had ever seen it, and borrowed a razor from Sheriff Granger to shave properly. He bought new clothes from the general store, a white shirt and dark trousers that made him look handsome and civilized. Even Deke got ready for the wedding. Laura bought him a new leather collar from the harness maker, and Ted threatened to give him a bath if he didn't stay clean. 3 days before the ceremony, Laura was surprised by a visitor. Young Toby Miller appeared at the forge, freshly scrubbed and carrying a small wooden box. Miss Laura, he said shyly, I made something for you and Mr. Ted. Laura knelt to his level. What is it, Toby? The boy opened the box to reveal 2 simple wooden rings, carved with careful precision. I know you already got a real ring, he said quickly, but I thought maybe you could use these for the ceremony and then keep them after, as a reminder. Laura felt tears prick her eyes. Toby, these are beautiful. Did you carve them yourself? The boy nodded proudly. Mr. Patterson taught me how to work with wood. He said I got good hands for it. Ted knelt beside Laura and examined the rings. These are fine work, Toby. Real fine work. You like them? I love them, Laura said, meaning it. Thank you so much. Toby beamed and ran off to tell his mother about the compliments. Laura and Ted sat in the forge, admiring the wooden rings. That boy has been through so much, Laura said softly. He's strong, like someone else I know. Ted squeezed her hand. I've been thinking we should ask him to be part of the ceremony, as our ring bearer. I was thinking the same thing. The night before the wedding, Laura sat with Ted on the porch of the old shack. Tomorrow, they would move into the house Ted had built near the new forge, and the shack would be abandoned. But tonight it felt right to be here, where their relationship had truly begun. Nervous? Ted asked. A little. You? Terrified. Laura laughed. Why terrified? Because I keep thinking I'll wake and find this was all a dream, that you'll change your mind, or realize you could do better, or... Ted stopped and shook his head. I've never been this happy, Laura. It scares me. Laura leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you ever wish I'd never come to Sand Creek? The question surprised him. What? No. Why would you ask that? I brought nothing but trouble. If I hadn't answered your advertisement, if I hadn't come looking for you, the Redstone men might never have found you. You could have lived quietly, safely. Ted was quiet for a moment. Laura, look at me. She lifted her head to meet his eyes. Every day, he said seriously. Every single day, right up until I met you. What? You asked if I ever wish you'd never come. The answer is every day until I met you. That's when I stopped wishing you'd never come and started being grateful you did. Laura felt her eyes fill with tears. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. And the answer is no, never. Not even when we were facing down Cranach and his men. Not even when I thought we might die. Ted cupped her face in his hands. You gave me back my life, Laura. Not just by nursing me back to health, but by giving me something to fight for, something to build. I was so lost when I came here. So was I. But we found each other. Laura kissed him then, soft and sweet under the Kansas stars. Tomorrow would bring their wedding and the start of their married life. But tonight, she was content to sit with the man she loved and remember how far they'd both come. Later, after Ted had walked her back to town, Laura sat in her small room for the last time and wrote a letter. Dear Mrs. Fletcher, she began, addressing the landlady from her Philadelphia boarding house. I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to let you know that I found a better life. Thank you for keeping me standing long enough to reach it. Sincerely, Laura Sutton. She sealed the letter and set it aside to post after the wedding. It wasn't much, but it felt important to close that chapter of her life properly. Laura looked around the tiny room that had been her home for so many weeks. Tomorrow she would pack her few belongings and move into Ted's house. She would have a real home again, with a man who loved her for who she was, not what she could provide. From the window, she could see the new forge in the distance, solid and permanent against the night sky. Soon it would be her forge, too, their forge, where they would work together and build their life together. Laura smiled and began preparing for bed. Tomorrow was her wedding day, and she had never been more ready for anything in her life. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of new beginnings. Chapter 12. Laura woke before dawn on her wedding day, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. She lay in the narrow bed in her room above the general store, listening to the wind whistle around the corners of the building. Today was the last morning she would wake up alone. She dressed carefully in her everyday clothes and went downstairs to find Mr. Walsh already awake, brewing coffee. Morning, bride, he said with a smile. How are you feeling? Nervous, Laura admitted, but happy. Good nervous or bad nervous? Good nervous, like standing at the edge of something wonderful. Mr. Walsh handed her a cup of coffee. Mrs. Eaton will be here soon to help you get ready. She's been looking forward to this almost as much as you have. Laura sipped her coffee and watched the sun rise over Sand Creek. In a few hours, she would be Laura Reaves. The thought made her smile. Mrs. Eaton arrived an hour later, carrying a basket and wearing her best dress. Come along, dear, she said briskly. We have work to do. They went upstairs to Laura's small room, where her wedding dress hung carefully from the window frame. Mrs. Eaton had brought ribbons for Laura's hair and a small bouquet of prairie flowers that she'd somehow managed to find despite the early spring weather. Sit down, Mrs. Eaton instructed, pulling out a brush. Let me fix your hair properly. Laura sat still while the older woman brushed out her chestnut hair and arranged it in a simple but elegant style, weaving the blue ribbons through the braids. There, Mrs. Eaton said, stepping back to admire her work. Beautiful. Now let's get you into that dress. The pale blue muslin fit perfectly, and the small embroidered flowers around the neckline caught the morning light. Laura looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked happy. She looked loved. Oh, my dear, Mrs. Eaton said, her eyes filling with tears. You look radiant. Meanwhile, across town at the new forge, Ted was having his own struggles with nerves. He'd been awake since before dawn, pacing around the building and fiddling with tools that didn't need fixing. The fire in the forge was burning hotter than necessary, and he found himself reheating the same piece of iron over and over again without actually working it. His hands were shaking slightly, and he kept dropping things. Easy there, said a voice from the doorway. Ted turned to see Sheriff Granger leaning against the frame, already dressed in his best suit for the ceremony, Deke wagging his tail, looking up at him. Having second thoughts? The sheriff asked. No, Ted said quickly. Not about marrying Laura, just nervous about the whole public ceremony part. Understandable. You've been hiding from people for 3 years. Now you're about to promise yourself to one in front of half the town. Ted set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. What if I mess up the vows? What if I say the wrong thing? Then you'll be like every other nervous groom who ever got married, Sheriff Granger said with a chuckle. Laura's not marrying you for your speaking skills, Ted. She's marrying you because she loves you. Ted nodded, feeling some of his tension ease. You're right. Of course, I'm right. Now stop melting that poor piece of iron and go get cleaned up. You've got a wedding to attend. By noon, a small crowd had gathered beside the new forge. Word had spread through Sand Creek, and most of the town had turned out to see Ted Reaves and Laura Sutton get married. Someone had strung canvas awnings between the buildings to provide shade, and the women had set up tables with food and coffee. Toby Miller stood importantly at the front of the gathering, wearing his best clothes and holding the wooden rings he'd carved. His chest was puffed out with pride at being chosen as ring-bearer. Deke lay in the shade by the anvil, wearing his new leather collar and looking resigned to all the fuss. True to Laura's request, he was staying inside for the ceremony, even though inside was really just the open-air forge. Sheriff Granger took his position in front of the anvil, holding a worn Bible he'd borrowed from the church. He'd performed marriages before, but this one felt special. These two people had earned their happiness through courage and determination. Ted stood beside the sheriff, dressed in his new white shirt and dark trousers. His face was clean-shaven, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked handsome and nervous and completely devoted to the woman who was about to become his wife. A murmur went through the crowd as Laura appeared, walking slowly from the direction of town. She looked beautiful in her pale blue dress, with Mrs. Eaton beside her and her small bouquet of prairie flowers in her hands. Ted's breath caught as he saw her. This was really happening. Laura was really going to marry him, here in front of God and their neighbors, beside the forge they'd built together. Laura reached his side and looked up at him with a smile that made his heart race. "Ready?" she whispered. "Ready," he whispered back. Sheriff Granger cleared his throat and began the simple ceremony. He spoke about marriage as a partnership, about two people choosing to build a life together through good times and bad. His words were plain and honest, just right for Laura and Ted. When it came time for the rings, young Toby stepped forward proudly and handed the wooden bands to the couple. Laura slipped one onto Ted's finger, and he placed the other on hers, right above the silver ring he'd made for her. Do you, Ted Reaves, take Laura Sutton to be your wife, to love and honor and stand beside through whatever life brings? I do, Ted said, his voice strong and clear. And do you, Laura Sutton, take Ted Reaves to be your husband, to love and honor and stand beside through whatever life brings? I do, Laura said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Then, by the authority given to me by the territory of Kansas, I pronounce you husband and wife. Sheriff Granger smiled. Ted, you may kiss your bride. Ted cupped Laura's face in his hands and kissed her gently while the crowd cheered and applauded. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. The women of Sand Creek had prepared cornbread, fresh pie, and strong coffee. Someone had brought out a fiddle, and there was music and laughter under the canvas awnings. Laura found herself swept into conversations with neighbors who welcomed her warmly as Mrs. Reaves. Children ran around between the tables while their parents shared stories and good wishes with the newlyweds. As the afternoon wore on, someone called for the bride and groom to dance. Laura laughed and shook her head, but the crowd insisted. Finally, she kicked off her shoes and danced barefoot in the grass beside the forge, while the fiddle played a simple waltz. Ted watched her with wonder. This brave woman who'd traveled halfway across the country to find him, who'd fought beside him, who'd chosen to build a life with him in this small Kansas town. When she held out her hand to him, he joined her in the dance, spinning her around while their friends and neighbors clapped and cheered. As evening approached, the celebration began to wind down. People started heading home to their own families, calling out final congratulations and promises to visit soon. Laura and Ted walked together to the house Ted had built near the forge. It was small but solid, with good windows and a wide front porch. Laura had been inside before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it was their home. Ted had prepared for this day. There was a new stone hearth in the main room, carefully built and ready for its first fire. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, sewn by Laura herself during the past week. The furniture was simple but well made, crafted by Ted's own hands. Laura set her sewing kit on the wooden table and looked around the room that would be the center of their life together. It felt right. It felt like home. "Happy?" Ted asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Very happy," Laura said, leaning back against his chest. They stood like that for a long moment, watching the last light of day fade through the windows. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called. All was as it had been, and all was as it should be. Laura thought about the journey that had brought her here. The pain of losing Aunt Margaret, the humiliation of Uncle Harold's betrayal, the long train ride west, and the shock of learning that Ted was supposedly dead. All of it had led to this moment, this quiet evening in this simple house with this good man. "I love you, Mrs. Reaves," Ted said softly. "I love you too, Mr. Reaves." Ted lit the fire in the new hearth, and Laura watched the flames catch and grow. She thought about everything that fire represented in their story. The flames that had supposedly killed Ted, the flash charges that had saved them both, and now this gentle fire that would warm their home. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had been different?" she asked. "If you'd never placed that advertisement, or if I'd never answered it?" Ted considered this. "Sometimes, but not with regret. Everything that happened, good and bad, brought us here, together." Laura nodded, understanding. "I used to think my life was over when Uncle Harold threw me out. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. And now I know I hadn't lost everything. I just lost everything that didn't matter." Laura smiled and took Ted's hand. "The things that really matter, we built ourselves." As full darkness swallowed Sand Creek, Laura and Ted sat together by their fire, planning their future. They talked about the work they would do, the life they would build, the children they hoped to have. They talked about planting the apple orchard Ted had dreamed of, and about expanding the forge as the town grew. But mostly they just sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the fire burn steadily and bright in their new hearth. The fire that once tried to burn them down had forged something stronger, something built to last. Anyone walking by who might take the time to look in through the window would have seen a man, a woman, and a dog silhouetted against a homely fire.